Chapter 16 of The History of Genghis Khan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The History of Genghis Khan by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 16, Conquests in China, 1211 to 1216. War continued. Rich and fertile country. Grand invasion. Simultaneous attack by 4 armies. After the death of Hujaku, the Emperor of China endeavored to defend his dominions against Genghis Khan by means of his other generals, and the war was continued for several years, during which time Genghis Khan made himself master of all the northern part of China and ravaged the whole country in the most reckless and cruel manner. The country was very populous and very rich. The people, unlike the Mongols and Tartars, lived by tilling the ground, and they practiced in great perfection many manufacturing and mechanic arts. The country was very fertile, and in the place of the boundless pasturages of the Mongol territories, it was covered in all directions with cultivated fields, gardens, orchards, and mulberry groves, while thriving villages and busy towns were scattered over the whole face of it. It was to protect this busy hive of wealth and industry that the Great Wall had been built ages before, for the Chinese had always been stationary, industrious, and peaceful, while the territories of Central Asia, lying to the north of them, had been filled from time immemorial with wild, roaming, and unscrupulous troops of marauders, like those who were now united under the banner of Genghis Khan. The wall had afforded for some hundreds of years an adequate protection, for no commander had appeared of sufficient power to organize and combine the various hordes on a scale great enough to enable them to force so strong a barrier. But now that Genghis Khan had come upon the stage, the barrier was broken through, and the terrible and reckless hordes poured in with all the force and fury of an inundation. In the year 1214, which was the year following that in which Hujaku was killed, Genghis Khan organized a force so large for the invasion of China that he divided it into 4 different battalions, which were to enter by different roads and ravage different portions of the country. Each of these divisions was by itself a great and powerful army, and the simultaneous invasion of 4 such masses of reckless and merciless enemies filled the whole land with terror and dismay. Enthusiasm of the troops. The Chinese emperor sent the best bodies of troops under his command to guard the passes in the mountains and the bridges and fording places on the rivers, hoping in this way to do something towards stemming the tide of these torrents of invasion. But it was all in vain. Genghis Khan had raised and equipped his forces by means, in a great measure, of the plunder which he had obtained in China the year before, and he had made great promises and glowing representations to his men in respect to the booty to be obtained in this new campaign. The troops were consequently full of ardor and enthusiasm, and they pressed on with such impetuosity as to carry all before them. Captives, immense plunder. The Emperor of China, in pursuing his measures of defense, had ordered all the men capable of bearing arms in the villages and in the open country to repair to the nearest large city or fortress, there to be enrolled and equipped for service. The consequence was that the Mongols found in many places, as they advanced through the country, nobody but infirm old men and women and children in the hamlets and villages. A great many of these, especially such as seemed to be of most consequence, the handsomest and best of the women and the oldest children, they seized and took with them in continuing their march, intending to make slaves of them, and also of all the silks and other rich and valuable merchandise which they found, and distributed it as plunder. The spoil which they obtained, too, in sheep and cattle was enormous, From it they made up immense flocks and herds, which were driven off into the Mongol country. The rest were slaughtered and used to supply the army with food. Dreadful ravages. It was the custom of the invaders, after having pillaged a town and its environs, and taken away all which they could convert to any useful purpose for themselves, to burn the town itself, and then to march on, leaving in the place only a smoking heap of ruins, with the miserable remnant of the population which they had spared wandering about the scene of desolation in misery and despair. Base use made of the captives. They made a most cowardly and atrocious use, too, of the prisoners whom they conveyed away. When they arrived at a fortified town where there was a garrison or any other armed force prepared to resist them, they would bring forward these helpless captives and put them in the forefront of the battle in such a manner that the men on the walls could not shoot their arrows at their savage assailants without killing their own wives and children. The officers commanded the men to fire notwithstanding, but they were so moved by the piteous cries which the women and children made that they could not bear to do it, and so they refused to obey, and in the excitement and confusion thus produced, the Mongols easily obtained possession of the town. Extent of Mongol conquests. There are two great rivers in China, both of which flow from west to east, and they are at such a distance from each other and from the frontiers that they divide the territory into three nearly equal parts. The northernmost of these rivers is the Wang-ho. The Mongols in the course of 2 years overran and made themselves masters of almost the whole country lying north of this river, that is, of about 1/3 of China proper. There were, however, some strongly fortified towns which they found it very difficult to conquer. The siege of Yenking. Among other places, there was the imperial city of Yenking, where the emperor himself resided, which was so strongly defended that for some time the Mongols did not venture to attack it. At length, however, Genghis Khan came himself to the place and concentrated there a very large force. The emperor and his court were very much alarmed, expecting an immediate assault. Still, Genghis Khan hesitated. Some of his generals urged him to scale the walls and so force his way into the city, but he thought it more politic to adopt a different plan. Proposed terms of arrangement. So he sent an officer into the town with proposals of peace to be communicated to the emperor. In these proposals, Genghis Khan said that he himself was inclined to spare the town, but that to appease his soldiers, who were furious to attack and pillage the city, it would be necessary to make them considerable presents, and that, if the emperor would agree to such terms with him as should enable him to satisfy his men in this respect, he would spare the city and would retire. Difference of opinion. The emperor and his advisers were much perplexed at the receipt of this proposal. There was great difference of opinion among the councillors in respect to the reply which was to be made to it. Some were in favor of rejecting it at once. One general, not content with a simple rejection of it, proposed that, to show the indignation and resentment which they felt in receiving it, the garrison should march out of the gates and attack the Mongols in their camp. Consultation on the subject. There were other ministers, however, who urged the emperor to submit to the necessity of the case and make peace with the conqueror. They said that the idea of going out to attack the enemy in their camp was too desperate to be entertained for a moment, and if they waited within the walls and attempted to defend themselves there, they exposed themselves to a terrible danger without any countervailing hope of advantage at all commensurate with it. For if they failed to save the city, they were all utterly and irretrievably ruined, and if, on the other hand, they succeeded in repelling the assault, it was only a brief respite that they could hope to gain, for the Mongols would soon return in greater numbers and in a higher state of excitement and fury than ever. Besides, they said, the garrison was discontented and depressed in spirit, and would make but a feeble resistance. It was composed mainly of troops brought in from the country, away from their families and homes, and all that they desired was to be released from duty, in order that they might go and see what had become of their wives and children. The conditions accepted, terms of peace agreed upon. The emperor in the end adopted this counsel, and he sent a commissioner to the camp of Genghis Khan to ask on what terms peace could be made. Genghis Khan stated the conditions. They were very hard, but the emperor was compelled to submit to them. One of the stipulations was that Genghis Khan was to receive one of the Chinese princesses, a daughter of the late Emperor Yangtze, to add to the number of his wives. There were also to be delivered to him for slaves 500 young boys and as many girls, 3,000 horses, a large quantity of silk, and an immense sum of money. As soon as these conditions were fulfilled, after dividing the slaves and the booty among the officers and soldiers of his army, Genghis Khan raised the siege and moved off to the northward. In respect to the captives that his soldiers had taken in the towns and villages, the women and children spoken of above, the army carried off with them all that were old enough to be of any value as slaves. The little children, who would only, they thought, be in the way, they massacred. The emperor's uneasiness. Consultations. The emperor was by no means easy after the Mongol army had gone. A marauding enemy like that, bought off by the payment of a ransom, is exceedingly apt to find some pretext for returning, and the emperor did not feel that he was safe. Very soon after the Mongols had withdrawn, he proposed to his council the plan of removing his court southward to the other side of the Wang Ho, to a large city in the province of Henan. Some of his counselors made great objections to this proposal. They said that if the emperor withdrew in that manner from the northern provinces, that portion of his empire would be irretrievably lost. Genghis Khan would soon obtain complete and undisputed possession of the whole of it. The proper course to be adopted, they said, was to remain and make a firm stand in defense of the capital and of the country. They must levy new troops, repair the fortifications, recruit the garrison, and lay in supplies of food and other military stores, and thus prepare themselves for a vigorous and efficient resistance in case the enemy should return. But the emperor could not be persuaded. He said that the treasury was exhausted, the troops were discouraged, the cities around the capital were destroyed, and the whole country was so depopulated by the devastations of the Mongols that no considerable number of fresh levies could be obtained, and that consequently the only safe course for the government to pursue was to retire to the southward, beyond the river. He would, however, he added, leave his son with a strong garrison to defend the capital. Abandonment of the capital. Revolt of the guards. He accordingly took with him a few favorites of his immediate family and a small body of troops, and commenced his journey, a journey which was considered by all the people as a base and ignoble flight. He involved himself in endless troubles by this step. A revolt broke out on the way among the guards who accompanied him. One of the generals who headed the revolt sent a messenger to Genghis Khan, informing him of the emperor's abandonment of his capital, and offering to go over, with all the troops under his command, to the service of Genghis Khan, if Genghis Khan would receive him. The siege of the capital renewed. When Genghis Khan heard thus of the retreat of the emperor from his capital, he was, or pretended to be, much incensed. He considered the proceeding as in some sense an act of hostility against himself, and as such an infraction of the treaty and a renewal of the war. So he immediately ordered one of his leading generals, a certain chieftain named Mingan, to proceed southward at the head of a large army and lay siege to Yanqing again. The old emperor, who seems now to have lost all spirit and to have given himself up entirely to despondency and fear, was greatly alarmed for the safety of his son the prince, whom he had left in command at Yanqing. He immediately sent orders to his son to leave the city and come to him. The departure of the prince, in obedience to these orders, of course threw an additional gloom over the city, and excited still more the general discontent which the emperor's conduct had awakened. Wan Yen and Man Yen, their perplexity. The prince, on his departure, left 2 generals in command of the garrison. Their names were Wan Yen and Man Yen. They were left to defend the city as well as they could from the army of Mongols under Mingan, which was now rapidly drawing near. The generals were greatly embarrassed and perplexed with the difficulties of their situation. The means of defense at their disposal were wholly inadequate, and they knew not what to do. Suicide proposed. At length one of them, Wan Yen, proposed to the other that they should kill themselves. This Man Yen refused to do. Man Yen was the commander on whom the troops chiefly relied, and he considered suicide a mode of deserting one's post scarcely less dishonorable than any other. He said that his duty was to stand by his troops, and if he could not defend them where they were, to endeavor to draw them away, while there was an opportunity, to a place of safety. Wan Yen in despair. So Wan Yen, finding his proposal rejected, went away in a rage. He retired to his apartment and wrote a dispatch to the emperor, in which he explained the desperate condition of affairs and the impossibility of saving the city, and in the end declared himself deserving of death for not being able to accomplish the work which his Majesty had assigned to him. He enveloped and sealed this dispatch, and then, calling his domestics together, he divided among them, in a very calm and composed manner, all his personal effects, and then took leave of them and dismissed them. His suicide. A single officer only now remained with him. In the presence of this officer he wrote a few words, and then sent him away. As soon as the officer had gone, he drank a cup of poison which he had previously ordered to be prepared for him, and in a few minutes was a lifeless corpse. Man Yen's plan. Petition of the wives. In the meantime, the other general, Man Yen, had been making preparations to leave the city. His plan was to take with him such troops as might be serviceable to the emperor, but to leave all the inmates of the palace, as well as the inhabitants of the city, to their fate. Among the people of the palace were, it seems, a number of the emperor's wives, whom he had left behind at the time of his own flight, he having taken with him, at that time, only a few of the more favored ones. These women who were left, when they heard that Man Yen was intending to abandon the city with a view of joining the emperor in the south, came to him in a body and begged him to take them with him. Sacking of the city by Mingan. In order to relieve himself of their solicitations, he said that he would do so, but he added that he must leave the city himself with the guards to prepare the way, and that he would return immediately for them. They were satisfied with this promise, and returned to the palace to prepare for the journey. Man Yen at once left the city, and very soon after he had gone, Mingan, the Mongol general, arrived at the gates, and meeting with no effectual resistance, he easily forced his way in, and a scene of universal terror and confusion ensued. The soldiers spread themselves over the city in search of plunder, and killed all who came in their way. They plundered the palace and then set it on fire. So extensive was the edifice, and so vast were the stores of clothing and other valuables which it contained, even after all the treasures which could be made available to the conquerors had been taken away, that the fire continued to burn among the ruins for a month or more. Massacres. What became of the unhappy women who were so cruelly deceived by Man Yen in respect to their hopes of escape does not directly appear. They doubtless perished with the other inhabitants of the city in the general massacre. Soldiers at such a time, while engaged in the sack and plunder of a city, are always excited to a species of insane fury, and take a savage delight in thrusting their pikes into all that come in their way. Fate of Man Yen. Man Yan excused himself, when he arrived at the quarters of the emperor, for having thus abandoned the women to their fate, by the alleged impossibility of saving them. He could not have succeeded, he said, in effecting his own retreat and that of the troops who went with him, if he had been encumbered in his movements by such a company of women. The emperor accepted this excuse, and seemed to be satisfied with it, though not long afterward Man Yan was accused of conspiracy against the emperor, and was put to death. Treasures. Mingan took possession of the imperial treasury, where he found great stores of silk, and also of gold and silver plate. All these things he sent to Genghis Khan, who remained still at the north at a grand encampment which he had made in Tartary. Conquests extended. Governors appointed. After this, other campaigns were fought by Genghis Khan in China, in the course of which he extended his conquests still farther to the southward, and made himself master of a very great extent of country. After confirming these conquests, he selected from among such Chinese officers as were disposed to enter into his service suitable persons to be appointed governors of the provinces, and in this way annexed them to his dominions. These officers, thus transferring their allegiance from the emperor to him, and covenanting to send to him the tribute which they should annually collect from their respective dominions. Everything being thus settled in this quarter, Genghis Khan next turned his attention to the western frontiers of his empire, where the Tartar and Mongol territory bordered on Turkestan and the dominions of the Mohammedans. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The History of Genghis Khan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The History of Genghis Khan by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 17, The Sultan Mohammed, 1217. The portion of China which Genghis Khan had added to his dominions by the conquest described in the last chapter was called Cathay, and the possession of it, added to the extensive territories which were previously under his sway, made his empire very vast. The country which he now held, either under his direct government or as tributary provinces and kingdoms, extended north and south through the whole interior of Asia, and from the shores of the Japan and China seas on the east, nearly to the Caspian Sea on the west, a distance of nearly 3,000 miles. Beyond his western limits lay Turkestan and other countries governed by the Mohammedans. Among the other Mohammedan princes there was a certain Sultan Mohammed, a great and very powerful sovereign, who reigned over an extensive region in the neighborhood of the Caspian Sea, though the principal seat of his power was a country called Kharazm. He was, in consequence, sometimes styled Mohammed Kharazm. It might perhaps have been expected that Genghis Khan, having subdued all the rivals within his reach in the eastern part of Asia, and being strong and secure in the possession of his power, would have found some pretext for making war upon the Sultan, with a view of conquering his territories too, and adding the countries bordering on the Caspian to his dominions. But for some reason or other he concluded in this instance to adopt a different policy. Whether it was that he was tired of war and wished for repose, or whether the Sultan's dominions were too remote, or his power too great to make it prudent to attack him, he determined on sending an embassy instead of an army, with a view of proposing to the Sultan a treaty of friendship and alliance. The time when this embassy was sent was in the year 1217, and the name of the principal ambassador was Mackinac. Mackinac set out on his mission accompanied by a large retinue of attendants and guards. The journey occupied several weeks, but at length he arrived in the Sultan's dominions. Soon after his arrival he was admitted to an audience of the Sultan, and there, accompanied by his own secretaries, and in the presence of all the chief officers of the Sultan's court, he delivered his message. He gave an account in his speech of the recent victories which his sovereign, Genghis Khan, had won, and of the great extension which his empire had in consequence attained. He was now become master, he said, of all the countries of Central Asia, from the eastern extremity of the continent up to the frontiers of the Sultan's dominions, and having thus become the Sultan's neighbor, he was desirous of entering into a treaty of amity and alliance with him, which would be obviously for the mutual interest of both. He had accordingly been sent an ambassador to the Sultan's court to propose such an alliance. In offering it, the emperor, he said, was actuated by a feeling of the sincerest goodwill. He wished the Sultan to consider him as a father, and he would look upon the Sultan as a son. According to the patriarchal ideas of government which prevailed in those days, the relation of father to son involved not merely the idea of a tie of affection connecting an older with a younger person, but it implied something of preeminence and authority on the one part, and dependence and subjection on the other. Perhaps Genghis Khan did not mean his proposition to be understood in this sense, but made it solely in reference to the disparity between his own and the Sultan's years, for he was himself now becoming considerably advanced in life. However this may be, the Sultan was at first not at all pleased with the proposition in the form in which the ambassador made it. He, however, listened quietly to Makinet's words, and said nothing until the public audience was ended. He then took Makinet alone into another apartment in order to have some quiet conversation with him. He first asked him to tell him the exact state of the case in respect to all the pretended victories which Genghis Khan had gained, and in order to propitiate him and induce him to reveal the honest truth, he made him a present of a rich scarf, splendidly adorned with jewels. "How is it," said he, "has the emperor really made all those conquests, and is his empire as extensive and powerful as he pretends? Tell me the honest truth about it." "What I have told your majesty is the honest truth about it," replied Makinet. "My master the emperor is as powerful as I have represented him, and this your majesty will soon find out in case you come to have any difficulty with him." This bold and defiant language on the part of the ambassador greatly increased the irritation which the Sultan felt before. He seemed much incensed, and replied in a very angry manner. "I know not what your master means," said he, "by sending such messages to me, telling me of the provinces that he has conquered, and boasting of his power, or upon what ground he pretends to be greater than I, and expects that I shall honor him as my father, and be content to be treated by him only as his son. Is he so very great a personage as this?" Makinet now found that perhaps he had spoken a little too plainly, and he began immediately to soften and modify what he had said, and to compliment the Sultan himself, who, as he was well aware, was really superior in power and glory to Genghis Khan, notwithstanding the great extension to which the empire of the latter had recently attained. He also begged that the Sultan would not be angry with him for delivering the message with which he had been entrusted. He was only a servant, he said, and he was bound to obey the orders of his master. He assured the Sultan, moreover, that if any unfavorable construction could by possibility be put upon the language which the emperor had used, no such meaning was designed on his part, but that in sending the embassage and in everything connected with it, the emperor had acted with the most friendly and honorable intentions. By means of conciliating language like this, The Sultan was at length appeased, and he finally was induced to agree to everything which the ambassador proposed. A treaty of peace and commerce was drawn up and signed, and after everything was concluded, Mahomet returned to the Mongol country, loaded with presents, some of which were for himself and his attendants, and others were for Genghis Khan. He was accompanied, too, by a caravan of merchants, who, in consequence of the new treaty, were going into the country of Genghis Khan with their goods, to see what they could do in the new market thus opened to them. This caravan traveled in company with Mahomet on his return, in order to avail themselves of the protection which the guard that attended him could afford in passing through the intervening countries. These countries being filled with hordes of Tartars, who were very little under the dominion of law, it would have been unsafe for a caravan of rich merchandise to pass through them without an escort. Genghis Khan was greatly pleased with the result of his embassy. He was also much gratified with the presents that the Sultan had sent him, which consisted of costly stuffs for garments, beautiful and highly wrought arms, precious stones, and other similar articles. He welcomed the merchants, too, and opened facilities for them to travel freely throughout his dominions and dispose of their goods. In order that future caravans might go and come at all times in safety, he established guards along the roads between his country and that of the Sultan. These guards occupied fortresses built at convenient places along the way, and especially at the crossing places on the rivers and in the passes of the mountains, and there orders were given to these guards to scour the country in every direction around their respective posts, in order to keep it clear of robbers. Whenever a band of robbers was formed, the soldiers hunted them from one lurking place to another until they were exterminated. In this way, after a short time, the country became perfectly safe, and the caravans of merchants could go and come with the richest goods, and even with treasures of gold and silver, without any fear. At first, it would seem, some of the merchants from the countries of Mohammed asked too much for their goods. At least a story is told of a company who came very soon after the opening of the treaty, and who offered their goods first to Genghis Khan himself, but they asked such high prices for them that he was astonished. "I suppose," said he, "by your asking such prices as these, you imagine that I have never bought any goods before." He then took them to see his treasures, and showed them over 1,000 large chests filled with valuables of every description, gold and silver utensils, rich silks, arms and accoutrements, specially adorned with precious stones, and other such commodities. He told them that he showed them these things in order that they might see that he had had some experience in respect to dealings in merchandise of that sort before, and knew something of its just value, and that since they had been so exorbitant in their demands, presuming probably upon the ignorance of those whom they came to deal with, he should send them back with all their goods, and not allow them to sell them anywhere in his dominions at any price. This threat he put in execution. The merchants were obliged to go back without selling any of their goods at all. The next company of merchants that came, having heard of the adventure of the others, determined to act on a different principle. Accordingly, when they came into the presence of the Khan with their goods, and he asked them the prices of some of them, they replied that his Majesty might himself fix the price of the articles, as he was a far better judge of the value of such things than they were. Indeed, they added that if his Majesty chose to take them without paying anything at all, he was welcome to do so. This answer pleased the emperor very much. He paid them double price for the articles which he selected from their stores, and he granted them peculiar privileges in respect to trading with his subjects while they remained in his dominions. The trade which was thus opened between the dominions of the Sultan and those of Genghis Khan was not, however, wholly in the hands of merchants coming from the former country. Soon after the coming of the caravan last mentioned, Genghis Khan fitted out a company of merchants from his own country, who were to go into the country of the Sultan, taking with them such articles, the products of the country of the Mongols, as they might hope to find a market for there. There were 4 principal merchants, but they were attended by a great number of assistants, servants, camel drivers, etc., so that the whole company formed quite a large caravan. Genghis Khan sent with them 3 ambassadors who were to present to the Sultan renewed assurances of the friendly feelings which he entertained for him, and of his desire to encourage and promote as much as possible the commercial intercourse between the 2 countries, which had been so happily begun. The 3 ambassadors whom Genghis Khan selected for this service were themselves Mohammedans. He had several persons of this faith among the officers of his court, although the Mongols had a national religion of their own, which was very different from that of the Mohammedans. Still, all forms of worship were tolerated in Genghis Khan's dominions, and the emperor was accustomed to take good officers into his service wherever he could find them, without paying any regard to the nature of their religious belief, so far as their general duties were concerned. But now, in sending this deputation to the Sultan, he selected the ambassadors from among the Mohammedans of his court, thinking that it would please the Sultan better to receive his message through persons of his own religious faith. Besides, the 3 persons whom he appointed were natives of Turkestan, and they were, of course, well acquainted with the language of the country and with the country itself. Besides the merchants and the ambassadors, Genghis Khan gave permission to each of his wives, and also to each of the great lords of his court, to send a servant or messenger with the caravan, to select and purchase for their masters and mistresses whatever they might find most curious or useful in the Mohammedan cities which the caravan might visit. The lords and ladies were all very glad to avail themselves of the opportunity thus afforded them. All these persons, the ambassadors and their suite, the merchants and their servants, and the special messengers sent by the lords and ladies of the court, formed, as may well be supposed, a very numerous company. It is said that the caravan, when ready to commence its march, contained no less than 450 persons. Everything being at last made ready, the caravan set out on its long journey. It was accompanied by a suitable escort, and in order to provide still more effectually for the safety of the rich merchandise and the valuable lives committed to it, Genghis Khan sent on orders beforehand to all the military stations on the way, directing the captains to double the guard on their respective sections of the road while the caravan was passing. By means of these and other similar precautions, the expedition accomplished the journey in safety, and arrived without any misfortune in the Mohammedan country. Very serious misfortunes, however, awaited them there immediately after their arrival, arising out of a train of events which had been for some time in progress, and which I must now go back a little to describe. It seems that some difference had arisen some time before this between the Sultan Mohammed and the Caliph of Baghdad, who was the great head of the Mohammedan power. Mohammed applied to the Caliph to grant him certain privileges and powers which had occasionally been bestowed on other sultans who had rendered great services to the Mohammedan empire. He claimed that he had merited these rewards by the services which he had rendered. He had conquered, he said, more than 100 princes and chieftains, and had cut off their heads and annexed their territories to his dominions, thus greatly enlarging and extending the Mohammedan power. Mohammed made this demand of the Caliph through the medium of an ambassador whom he sent to Baghdad. The Caliph, after hearing what the ambassador had to say, refused to comply. He said that the services which Mohammed had rendered were not of sufficient importance and value to merit the honors and privileges which Mohammed demanded. But although he thus declined complying with Mohammed's request, he showed a disposition to treat the Sultan himself with all proper deference, by sending an ambassador of his own to accompany Mohammed's ambassador on his return, with instructions to communicate the reply which the Caliph felt bound to make in a respectful and courteous manner. Mohammed received the Caliph's ambassador very honorably, and in his presence concealed the anger which the answer of the Caliph excited in his mind. As soon as the ambassador was gone, however, he convened a grand council of all the great chieftains and generals and ministers of state in his dominions, and announced to them his determination to raise an army and march to Baghdad, with a view of deposing the Caliph and reigning in his stead. The great personages assembled at the council were very ready to enter into this scheme, for they knew that if it was successful, there would be a great many honors and a great deal of booty that would fall to their share in the final distribution of the spoil. So they all engaged with great zeal in aiding the Sultan to form and equip his army. In due time the expedition was ready, and the Sultan commenced his march. But as often happens in such cases, the preparations had been hindered by various causes of delay, and it was too late in the season when the army began to move. The forces moved slowly, too, after they commenced their march, so that the winter came on while they were among the passes of the mountains. The winter was unusually severe, and the troops suffered so much from the frosts and the rains, and from the various hardships to which they were in consequence exposed, that the Sultan found it impossible to go on. He was consequently obliged to return and begin his work over again. And the worst of it was that the Caliph was now aware of his designs, and would be able, he knew, before the next season, to take effectual measures to defend himself. When the Caliph heard of the misfortunes which had befallen the Sultan's army, and his narrow escape from the dangers of a formidable invasion, he was at first overjoyed, and he resolved at once on making war upon the rebellious Sultan. In forming his plans for the campaign, the idea occurred to him of endeavoring to incite Genghis Khan to invade the Sultan's dominions from the east, while he himself attacked him from the west. For Baghdad, the capital of the Caliph, was to the westward of the Sultan's country, as the empire of the Mongols was to the eastward of it. But when the Caliph proposed his plan to his counselors, some of them objected to it very strenuously. The Sultan and the people of his country were, like the Caliph himself, Mohammedans, while the Mongols were of another religion altogether, or, as the Mohammedans called them, unbelievers or infidels. And the counselors who objected to the Caliph's proposal said that it would be very wrong to bring the enemies of God into the country of the faithful to guard against a present and temporary danger, and thereby perhaps in the end occasion the ruin both of their religion and their empire. It would be an impious deed, they thought, thus to bring in a horde of barbarian infidels to wage war with them against their brethren. To this the Caliph replied that the emergency was so critical that they were justified in availing themselves of any means that offered to save themselves from the ruin with which they were threatened. And as to the possibility that Genghis Khan, if admitted to the country as their ally, would in the end turn his armies against them, he said that they must watch and take measures to guard against such a danger. Besides, he would rather have an open unbeliever like Genghis Khan for a foe than a Mohammedan traitor and rebel like the Sultan. He added, moreover, that he did not believe that the Mongol emperor felt any animosity or ill will against the Mohammedans or against their faith. It was evident, indeed, that he did not, for he had a great many Mohammedans in his dominions, and he allowed them to live there without molestation. He even had Mohammedan officers of very high rank in his court. So it was finally decided to send a message and invite him to join the Caliph in making war on the Sultan. The difficulty was now to contrive some means by which this message could be conveyed through the Sultan's territories, which, of course, lay between the dominions of the Caliph and those of Genghis Khan. To accomplish this purpose, the Caliph resorted to a very singular device. Instead of writing his communication in a letter, he caused it to be pricked with a needle and some indigo by a sort of tattooing process upon the messenger's head, in such a manner that it was concealed by his hair. The messenger was then disguised as a countryman and sent forth. He succeeded in accomplishing the journey in safety, and when he arrived Genghis Khan had only to cause his head to be shaved, when the inscription containing the Caliph's proposal to him at once became legible. This method of making the communication was considered very safe, for even if, from any accident, the man had been intercepted on the way on suspicion of being a messenger, the Sultan's men would have found nothing in searching him to confirm their suspicions, for it is not at all probable that they would have thought of looking for a letter among his hair. Genghis Khan was well pleased to receive the proposals of the Caliph, but he sent back word in reply that he could not at present engage in any hostile movement against the Sultan on account of the treaty of peace and commerce which he had recently established with him. So long as the Sultan observed the stipulations of the treaty, he felt bound in honor, he said, not to break it. He knew, however, he added, that the restless spirit of the Sultan would not long allow things to remain in the posture they were then in, and that on the first occasion given he would not fail to declare war against him. Things were in this state when the grand caravan of merchants and ambassadors which Genghis Khan had sent arrived at the frontiers of the Sultan's dominions. After passing the frontier, the first important place which they reached was a city called Otrar. They were received very courteously by the governor of this place, and were much pleased with the opportunity afforded them to rest from the fatigues of their long journey. It seems, however, after all, that the governor's friendship for his guests was only pretended, for he immediately wrote to the Sultan, informing him that a party of persons had arrived at his city from the Mongol country, who pretended to be merchants and ambassadors, but that he believed that they were spies, for they were extremely inquisitive about the strength of the garrisons and the state of the defenses of the country generally. He had no doubt, he added, that they were emissaries sent by Genghis Khan to find out the best way of invading his dominions. One account states that the motive which induced the governor to make these representations to the Sultan was some offense which he took at the familiar manner in which he was addressed by one of the ambassadors, who was a native of Otrar, and had known the governor in former times when he was a private person. Another says that his object was to have the expedition broken up, in order that he might seize for himself the rich merchandise and the valuable presents which the merchants and ambassadors had in their possession. At any rate, he wrote to the Sultan denouncing the whole party as foreign emissaries and spies, and in a short time he received a reply from the Sultan directing him to put them all to death, or otherwise to deal with them as he thought proper. So he invited the whole party to a grand entertainment in his palace, and then, at a given signal, probably after most of them had become in some measure helpless from the influence of the wine, a body of his guards rushed in and massacred them all. Or rather, they attempted to massacre them all, but one of the merchant's men contrived in the confusion to make his escape. He succeeded in getting back into the Mongol country, where he reported what had happened to Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan was greatly exasperated when he heard these tidings. He immediately called together his sons and all the great lords and chieftains of his court, and recited to them the story of the massacre of the merchants in such a manner as to fill their hearts with indignation and rage, and to inspire them all with a burning thirst for revenge. He also immediately sent word to the Sultan that, since by so infamous an action he had violated all the engagements which had subsisted between them, he from that instant declared himself his mortal enemy, and would take vengeance upon him for his treacherousness and cruelty by ravaging his country with fire and sword. This message was sent, it was said, by 3 ambassadors, whose persons ought to have been considered sacred, according to every principle of international law. But the Sultan, as soon as they had delivered their message, ordered their heads to be cut off. This new massacre excited the rage and fury of Genghis Khan to a higher pitch than ever. For 3 days, it is said, He neither ate nor slept, and seemed almost beside himself with mingled vexation, grief, and anger. And afterward he busied himself night and day with the arrangements for assembling his army and preparing to march, and he allowed himself no rest until everything was ready. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of the History of Genghis Khan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Johns, Salt Lake City, Utah. The History of Genghis Khan by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 18, The War with the Sultan, 1217 to 1218. Genghis Khan made his preparations for a war on an immense scale. He sent messengers in every direction to all the princes, khans, governors, and other chieftains throughout his empire, with letters explaining to them the cause of the war and ordering them to repair to the places of rendezvous which he appointed, with all the troops that they could raise. He gave particular directions in respect to the manner in which the men were to be armed and equipped. The arms required were the saber, the bow, with a quiver full of arrows, and the battle-axe. Each soldier was to also carry a rope, ropes and cordage being continually in demand among people living on horseback and in tents. The officers were to wear armor as well as to carry arms. Those who could afford it were to provide themselves with a complete coat of mail. The rest were to wear helmets and breastplates only. The horses were also to be protected as far as possible by breastplates, either of iron or of leather thick and tough enough to prevent an arrow from penetrating. When the troops thus called for appeared at the place of rendezvous appointed for them, Genghis Khan found, as is said, that he had an army of 700,000 men. The army being thus assembled, Genghis Khan caused certain rules and regulations, or articles of war, as they might be called, to be drawn up and promulgated to the troops. One of the rules was that no body of troops were ever to retreat without first fighting, whatever the imminence of the danger might be. He also ordered that where a body of men were engaged, if any subordinate division of them, as one company in a regiment, or one regiment in a battalion, should break ranks and fly before the order for a retreat should have been given by the proper authority, the rest were to leave fighting the enemy and attack the portion flying and kill them all upon the spot. The emperor also made formal provision for the event of his dying in the course of the campaign. In this case, a grand assembly of all the khans and chieftains of the empire was to be convened, and then, in the presence of these khans and of his sons, the constitution and laws of the empire, as he had established them, were to be read, and after the reading the assembly were to proceed to the election of a new khan, according to the forms which the constitution had provided. After all these affairs had been arranged, Genghis Khan put his army in motion. He was obliged, of course, to separate it into several grand divisions, and to send the several divisions forward by different roads and through different sections of the country. So large a body can never be kept together on a long march, on account of the immense quantity of food that is required, both for the horses and the men, and which must be supplied, in the main, by the country itself which they traverse, since neither horses nor men can carry food with them for more than a very few days. Genghis Khan put one of the largest divisions under the command of his son Genghis, the prince who distinguished himself so much in the conflicts by which his father raised himself to the supreme power. Genghis was ordered to advance with his division through Turkestan, the country where the prince Kushluk had sought refuge, and which still remained in some degree disaffected toward Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan himself, with the main body of the army, took a more southerly route, directly toward the dominions of the Sultan. In the meantime, the Sultan himself had not been idle. He collected together all the forces that he could command. When they were mustered, the number of men was found to be 400,000. This was a large army, though much smaller than that of Genghis Khan. The Sultan set out upon his march with his troops to meet the invaders. After advancing for some distance, he learned that the army of Genghis, which had passed through Turkestan, was at the northward of his position, and he found that by turning in that direction he might hope to meet and conquer that part of the Mongol force before it could have time to join the main body. He determined at once to adopt this plan. He accordingly turned his course and marched forward into the part of the country where he supposed Genghis to be. At length he came to a place where his scouts found, near a river, a great many dead bodies lying on the ground. Among the others who had fallen, there was one man who was wounded, but was not dead. This wounded man told the scouts that the bodies were those of persons who had been slain by the army of Genghis, which had just passed that way. The Sultan accordingly pressed forward and soon overtook them. Genghis was hastening on in order to join his father. Genghis consulted his generals in respect to what it was best to do. They advised him to avoid a battle. "We are not strong enough," said they, "to encounter alone the whole of the Sultan's army. It is better that we should retreat, which we can do in an orderly manner, and thus join the main body before we give the enemy battle. Or if the Sultan should attempt to pursue us, he cannot keep his army together in doing so. They will necessarily become divided into detachments on the road, and then we can turn and destroy them in detail, which will be a much surer mode of proceeding than for us to attack them in the mass." Genghis was not willing to follow this advice. "What will my father and my brothers think," said he, "when they see us coming to them, flying from the enemy, without having fought them, contrary to his express commands? No, we must stand our ground, trusting to our valor, and do our best. If we are to die at all, we had better be slain in battle than in flight. You have done your duty in admonishing me of the danger we are in, and now it remains for me to do mine in trying to bring you out of it with honor." So he ordered the army to halt and to be drawn up in order of battle. The battle was soon commenced, and it was continued throughout the day. The Mongols, though fewer in numbers, were superior to their enemies in discipline and in courage, and the advantage was obviously on their side, though they did not gain a decisive victory. Toward night, however, the Sultan's troops evinced everywhere a disposition to give way, and it was with great difficulty that the officers could induce them to maintain their ground until the darkness came on and put an end to the conflict. When at length the combatants could no longer see to distinguish friend from foe, the two armies withdrew to their respective camps and built their fires for the night. Genghis thought that by fighting during this day he had done all that his father required of him to vindicate the honor of the army, and that now it would be most prudent to retreat without risking another battle on the morrow. So he caused fresh supplies of fuel to be put upon the campfires in order to deceive the enemy, and then marched out of his camp in the night with all his men. The next morning, by the time that the Sultan's troops were again under arms, he had advanced far on his march to join his father, and was beyond their reach. He soon rejoined his father, and was received by him with great joy. Genghis Khan was extremely pleased with the course which his son had pursued, and bestowed upon him many public honors and rewards. After this, other great battles were fought between the two armies. At one of them, a great trumpet 15 feet long is mentioned among the other martial instruments that were used to excite the men to ardor in making the charge. In these battles the Mongols were victorious. The Sultan, however, still continued to make head as well as he could against the invaders, until at length he found that he had lost 160,000 of his men. This was almost half of his army, and the loss enfeebled him so much that he was convinced that it was useless for him any longer to resist the Mongols in the open field. So he sent off his army in detachments to the different towns and fortresses of his kingdom, ordering the several divisions to shut themselves up and defend themselves as well as they could in the places assigned to them, until better times should return. The Sultan, however, did not seek shelter in this way for himself. He selected from his troop a certain portion of those who were most active and alert, and were best mounted, and formed of them a sort of flying squadron, with which he could move rapidly from place to place through the country, wherever his aid might be most required. Genghis Khan, of course, now prepared to attack the cities where the several divisions of the Sultan's army had entrenched themselves. He wished first to get possession of Otrar, which was the place where the ambassadors and the merchants had been massacred. But the city was not very large, and so instead of marching toward it himself, he gave the charge of capturing it to two of his younger sons, whom he sent off for the purpose at the head of a suitable detachment. He himself, with the main body, set off upon a march toward the cities of Samarcand and Bokhara, which were the great central cities of the Sultan's dominions. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The History of Genghis Khan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The History of Genghis Khan by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 19, The Fall of Bokhara, 1217 to 1219. Bokhara was a great and beautiful city. It was situated in the midst of a very fine and fertile country, in a position very favorable for the trade and commerce of those days. It was also a great seat of learning and of the arts and sciences. It contained many institutions in which were taught such arts and sciences as were then cultivated, and students resorted to it from all the portions of Western Asia. The city proper was enclosed with a strong wall. Besides this, there was an outer wall 30 miles in circumference, which enclosed the suburbs of the town, and also a beautiful region of parks and gardens, which contained the public places of amusement and the villas of the wealthy inhabitants. It was this peaceful seat of industry and wealth that Genghis Khan, with his hordes of ruthless barbarians, was coming now to sack and plunder. The first city which the Mongols reached on their march toward Bokhara was one named Zarnuk. In approaching it, a large troop rode up toward the walls, uttering terrific shouts and outcries. The people shut the gates in great terror. Genghis Khan, however, sent an officer to them to say that it was useless for them to attempt to resist him, and to advise them to surrender at once. They must demolish their citadel, he said, and send out all the young and able-bodied men to Genghis Khan. The officer advised them, too, to send out presents to Genghis Khan as an additional means of propitiating him and inducing him to spare the town. The inhabitants yielded to this advice. The gates were thrown open. All the young men who were capable of bearing arms were marshaled and marched out to the Mongol camp. They were accompanied by the older men among the inhabitants, who took with them the best that the town contained for presents. Genghis Khan accepted the presents, ordered the young men to be enrolled in his army, and then, dismissing the older ones in peace, he resumed his march and went on his way. He next came to a town named Nur. One of the men from Zarnuk served as a guide to show the detachment which was sent to summon the city a near way to reach it. Nur was a sort of sacred town, having many holy places in it, which were resorted to by many pilgrims and other devotees. The people of Nur shut the gates, and for some time refused to surrender, but at last, finding that it was useless to attempt to resist, they opened the gates and allowed the Mongols to come in. Genghis Khan, to punish the inhabitants, as he said, for even thinking of resisting him, set aside a supply of cattle and other provisions to keep them from starving, and then gave up all the rest of the property found in the town to be divided among his soldiers as plunder. At length the army reached the great plain in which Bokhara was situated, and encamped before the town. Bokhara was very large and very populous, as may well be supposed from its outer wall of 30 miles in circuit, and Genghis Khan did not expect to make himself master of it without considerable difficulty and delay. He was, however, very intent on besieging and taking it, not only on account of the general wealth and importance of the place, but also because he supposed that the Sultan himself was at this time within the walls. He had heard that the Sultan had retreated there with his flying squadron, taking with him all his treasure. This was, however, a mistake. The Sultan was not there. He had gone there, it is true, at first, and had taken with him the most valuable of his treasures, but before Genghis Khan arrived, he had secretly withdrawn to Samarkand, thinking that he might be safer there. In truth, the Sultan was beginning to be very much disheartened and discouraged. Among other things which occurred to disturb his mind, certain letters were found and brought to him, as if they had been intercepted, which letters gave accounts of a conspiracy among his officers to desert him and go over to the side of Genghis Khan. These letters were not signed, and the Sultan could not discover who had written them, but the pretended conspiracy which they revealed filled his soul with anxiety and distress. It was only a pretended conspiracy, after all, for the letters were written by a man in Genghis Khan's camp, and with Genghis Khan's permission or connivance. This man was a Mohammedan, and had been in the Sultan's service, but the Sultan had put to death his father and his brothers on account of some alleged offense, and he had become so incensed at the act that he had deserted to Genghis Khan, and now he was determined to do his former sovereign all the mischief in his power. His intimate knowledge of persons and things connected with the Sultan's court and army enabled him to write these letters in such a way as to deceive the Sultan completely. It was past midsummer when the army of Genghis Khan laid siege to Bokhara, and it was not until the spring of the following year that they succeeded in carrying the outer wall, so strongly was the city fortified and so well was it defended. After having forced the outer wall, the Mongols destroyed the suburbs of the town, devastating the cultivated gardens and grounds, and pillaged the villas. They then took up their position around the inner wall and commenced the siege of the city itself in due form. The Sultan had left 3 of his greatest generals in command of the town. These men determined not to wait the operations of Genghis Khan in attacking the walls, but to make a sudden sally from the gates, with the whole force that could be spared, and attack the besiegers in their entrenchments. They made this sally in the night, at a time when the Mongols were least expecting it. They were, however, wholly unsuccessful. They were driven back into the city with great loss. The generals, it seems, had determined to risk all on this desperate attempt, and in case it failed, at once to abandon the city to its fate. Accordingly, when driven into the city through the gates on one side, they marched directly through it and passed out through the gates on the other side, hoping to save themselves and the garrison by this retreat, with a view of ultimately rejoining the Sultan. They, however, went first in a southerly direction from the city toward the river Amur. The generals took their families and those of the principal officers of the garrison with them. The night was dark, and they succeeded in leaving the city without being observed. In the morning, however, all was discovered, and Genghis Khan sent off a strong detachment of well-mounted troops in pursuit. These troops, after about a day's chase, overtook the flying garrison near the river. There was no escape for the poor fugitives, and the merciless Mongols destroyed them, almost every one, by riding over them, trampling them down with their horses' hoofs, and cutting them to pieces with their sabers. In the meantime, while this detachment had been pursuing the garrison, Genghis Khan, knowing that there were no longer any troops within the city to defend it, and that everything there was in utter confusion, determined on a grand final assault. But while his men were getting the engines ready to batter down the walls, a procession, consisting of all the magistrates and clergy, and a great mass of the principal citizens, came forth from one of the gates, bearing with them the keys of the city. These keys they offered to Genghis Khan in token of surrender, and begged him to spare their lives. The emperor received the keys, and said to the citizens that he would spare their lives on condition that, if there were any of the sultan's soldiers concealed in the city, they would give them up, and that they would also seize and deliver to him any of the citizens that were suspected of being in the sultan's interest. This they took a solemn oath that they would do. The soldiers, however, that is, those that remained in the town, were not delivered up. Most of them retired to the castle, which was a sort of citadel, and put themselves under the command of the governor of the castle, who, being a very energetic and resolute man, declared that he would never surrender. There were a great many of the young men of the town, sons of the leading citizens, who also retired to the castle, determined not to yield to the conqueror. Genghis Khan, having thus obtained the keys of the city itself, caused the gates to be opened, and his troops marched in and took possession. He had promised the citizens that his soldiers should spare the lives of the people and should not pillage the houses, on condition that the magistrates delivered up peaceably the public magazines of grain and other food to supply his army. Also that all the people who had buried or otherwise concealed gold and silver or other treasures should bring them forth again and give them up, or else make known where they were concealed. This the people promised that they would do. After having entered the town, Genghis Khan was riding about the streets on horseback at the head of his troop of guards when he came to a large and very beautiful edifice. The doors were wide, and he drove his horse directly in. His troops and the other soldiers who were there followed him in. There were also with him some of the magistrates of the town who were accompanying him in his progress about the city. After the whole party had entered the edifice, Genghis Khan looked around, and then asked them, in a jeering manner, if that was the Sultan's palace. "No," they said, "it is the house of God." The building was a mosque. On hearing this, Genghis Khan alighted from his horse, and giving the bridle to one of the principal magistrates to hold, he went up, in a very irreverent manner, to a sacred place where the priests were accustomed to sit. He seized the copy of the Koran which he found there, and threw it down under the feet of the horses. After amusing himself for a time in desecrating the temple by these and other similar performances, he caused his soldiers to bring in their provisions, and allowed them to eat and drink in the temple in a riotous manner, without any regard to the sacredness of the place or to the feelings of the people of the town, which he outraged by this conduct. A few days after this, Genghis Khan assembled all the magistrates and principal citizens of the town, and made a speech to them from an elevated stand or pulpit which was erected for the purpose. He began his speech by praising God, and claiming to be an object of his special favor, in proof of which he recounted the victories which he had obtained, as he said, through the divine aid. He then went on to denounce the perfidious conduct of the Sultan toward him in making a solemn treaty of peace with him, and then treacherously murdering his merchants and ambassadors. He said that the Sultan was a detestable tyrant, and that God had commissioned him to rid the earth of all such monsters. He said in conclusion that he would protect their lives, and would not allow his soldiers to take away their household goods, provided they surrendered to him fairly and honestly all their money and other treasures, and if any of them refused to do this, or to tell where their treasures were hid, he would put them to torture and compel them to tell. The wretched inhabitants of the town, feeling that they were entirely at the mercy of the terrible hordes that were in possession of the city, did not attempt to conceal anything. They brought forward their hidden treasures, and even offered their household goods to the conqueror if he was disposed to take them. They were only anxious to save, if possible, their dwellings and their lives. Genghis Khan appeared at first to be pleased with the submissive spirit which they manifested, but at last, under pretense that he heard of some soldiers being concealed somewhere, and perhaps irritated at the citadel's holding out so long against him, he ordered the town to be set on fire. The buildings were almost all of wood, and the fire raged among them with great fury. Multitudes of the inhabitants perished in the flames, and great numbers died miserably afterward from want and exposure. The citadel immediately afterward surrendered, and it would seem that Genghis Khan began to feel satisfied with the amount of misery which he had caused, for it is said that he spared the lives of the governor and of the soldiers, although we might have expected that he would have massacred them all. The citadel was, however, demolished, and thus the town itself, and all that pertained to it, became a mass of smoking ruins. The property pillaged from the inhabitants was divided among the Mongol troops, while the people themselves went away to roam as vagabonds and beggars over the surrounding country, and to die of want and despair. What difference is there between such a conqueror as this and the captain of a band of pirates or of robbers, except in the immense magnitude of the scale on which he perpetrates his crimes? The satisfaction which Genghis Khan felt at the capture of Bokhara was greatly increased by the intelligence which he received soon afterward from the two princes whom he had sent to lay siege to Otrar, informing him that the city had fallen into their hands, and that the governor of it, the officer who had so treacherously put to death the ambassadors and the merchants, had been taken and slain. The name of this governor was Gayer Khan. The Sultan, knowing that Genghis Khan would doubtless make this city one of his first objects of attack, left the governor a force of 50,000 men to defend it. He afterwards sent him an additional force of 10,000 men, under the command of a general named Kariakis. With these soldiers the governor shut himself up in the city. He knew very well that if he surrendered or was taken he could expect no mercy, and he went to work accordingly, strengthening the fortifications and laying in stores of provisions, determined to fight to the last extremity. The captain of the guard who came to assist him had not the same reason for being so very obstinate in the defense of the town, and this difference in the situation of the two commanders led to difficulty in the end, as we shall presently see. The Mongol princes began the siege of Otrar by filling up the ditches that encircle the outer wall of the town in the places where they wished to plant their battering rams to make breaches in the walls. They were hindered a great deal in their work, as is usual in such cases, by the sallies of the besieged, who rushed upon them in the night in great numbers and with such desperate fury that they often succeeded in destroying some of the engines or setting them on fire before they could be driven back into the town. This continued for some time, until at last the Mongol princes began to be discouraged, and they sent word to their father, who was then engaged in the siege of Bokhara, informing him of the desperate defense which was made by the garrison of Otrar, and asking his permission to turn the siege into a blockade, that is, to withdraw from the immediate vicinity of the walls, and to content themselves with investing the city closely on every side, so as to prevent anyone from going out or coming in until the provisions of the town should be exhausted, and the garrison be starved into a surrender. In this way, they said, the lives of vast numbers of the troops would be saved. But their father sent back word to them that they must do no such thing, but must go on and fight their way into the town, no matter how many of the men were killed. So the princes began again with fresh ardor, and they pushed forward their operations with such desperate energy that in less than a month the outer wall and the works of the besieged to defend it were all in ruins. The towers were beaten down, the ramparts were broken, and many breaches were made through which the besiegers might be expected at any moment to force their way into the town. The besieged were accordingly obliged to abandon the outer walls and retire within the inner lines. The Mongols now had possession of the suburbs, and after pillaging them of all that they could convert to their own use, and burning and destroying everything else, they advanced to attack the inner works, and here the contest between the besiegers and the garrison was renewed more fiercely than ever. The besieged continued their resistance for 5 months, defending themselves by every possible means from the walls, and making desperate sallies from time to time in order to destroy the Mongols' engines and kill the men. At length, Kariakis, the captain of the guard, who had been sent to assist the governor in defense of the town, began to think it was time that the carnage should cease and that the town should be surrendered. But the governor, who knew that he would most assuredly be beheaded if in any way he fell into the hands of the enemy, would not listen to any proposal of the kind. He succeeded also in exciting among the people of the town and among the soldiers of the garrison such a hatred of the Mongols, whom he represented as infidels of the very worst character, the enemies alike of God and man, that they joined him in the determination not to surrender. Kariakis now found himself an object of suspicion and distrust in the town and in the garrison on account of his having made the proposal to surrender, and feeling that he was not safe, he determined to make a separate peace for himself and his 10,000 by going out secretly in the night and giving himself up to the princes. He thought that by doing this, and by putting the Mongols in possession of the gate through which his troops were to march out, so as to enable them to gain admission to the city, his life would be spared, and that he might perhaps be admitted into the service of Genghis Khan. But he was mistaken in this idea. The princes said that a man who would betray his own countrymen would betray them if he ever had a good opportunity. So they ordered him and all his officers to be slain, and the men to be divided among the soldiers as slaves. They nevertheless took possession of the gate by which the deserters had come out, and by this means gained admission to the city. The governor fled to the citadel with all the men whom he could assemble, and shut himself up in it. Here he fought desperately for a month, making continual sallies at the head of his men, and doing everything that the most resolute and reckless bravery could do to harass and beat off the besiegers. But all was in vain. In the end, the walls of the citadel were so broken down by the engines brought to bear upon them that one day the Mongols, by a determined and desperate assault, made on all sides simultaneously, forced their way in through the most dreadful scenes of carnage and destruction, and began killing without mercy every soldier that they could find. The soldiers defended themselves to the last. Some took refuge in narrow courts and lanes, and on the roofs of the houses, for the citadel was so large that it formed of itself quite a little town, and fought desperately till they were brought down by the arrows of the Mongols. The governor took his position, in company with 2 men who were with him, on a terrace of his palace, and refused to surrender, but fought on furiously, determined to kill anyone who attempted to come near him. His wife was near, doing all in her power to encourage and sustain him. Genghis Khan had given orders to the princes not to kill the governor, but to take him alive. He wished to have the satisfaction of disposing of him himself. For this reason, the soldiers who attempted to take him on the terrace were very careful not to shoot their arrows at him, but only at the men who were with him. And while they did so, a great many of them were killed by the arrows which the governor and his two friends discharged at those who attempted to climb up to the place where they were standing. After a while, the two men were killed, but the governor remained alive. Yet nobody could come near him. Those that attempted it were shot, and fell back again among their companions below. The governor's wife supplied him with arrows as fast as he could use them. At length all the arrows were spent, and then she brought him stones, which he hurled down upon his assailants when they tried to climb up to him. But at last so many ascended together that the governor could not beat them all back, and he was at length surrounded and secured, and immediately put in irons. The princes wrote word at once to their father that the town was taken, and that the governor was in their hands a prisoner. They received orders to return to bring him with them to Bokhara. While on the way, however, another order came requiring them to put the prisoner to death, and this order was immediately executed. What was the fate of his courageous and devoted wife has never been known. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The History of Genghis Khan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The History of Genghis Khan by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 20, Battles and Sieges, 1219 to 1220. After the fall of Bokhara and Otrar, the war was continued for 2 years with great vigor by Genghis Khan and the Mongols, and the poor sultan was driven from place to place by his merciless enemies, until at last his cause was wholly lost, and he himself, as will appear in the next chapter, came to a miserable end. During the 2 years while Genghis Khan continued the war against him, a great many incidents occurred illustrating the modes of warfare practiced in those days, and the sufferings which were endured by the mass of the people in consequence of these terrible struggles between rival despots contending for the privilege of governing them. At one time Genghis Khan sent his son Juki with a large detachment to besiege and take a certain town named Saganak. As soon as Juki arrived before the place, he sent in a flag of truce to call upon the people of the town to surrender, promising at the same time to treat them kindly if they would do so. The bearer of the flag was a Mohammedan named Hassan. Juki probably thought that the message would be better received by the people of the town if brought to them by one of their own countrymen. But he made a great mistake in this. The people, instead of being pleased with the messenger because he was a Mohammedan, were very much exasperated against him. They considered him a renegade and a traitor, and although the governor had solemnly promised that he should be allowed to go and come in safety, so great a tumult arose that the governor found it impossible to protect him, and the poor man was torn to pieces by the mob. Juki immediately assaulted the town with all his force, and as soon as he got possession of it, he slaughtered without mercy all the officers and soldiers of the garrison, and killed also about 1/2 of the inhabitants, in order to avenge the death of his murdered messenger. He also caused a handsome monument to be erected to his memory in the principal square of the town. Juki treated the inhabitants of every town that dared to resist with extreme severity, while those that yielded at once were, in some degree, spared and protected. The consequence of this policy was that the people of many towns surrendered without attempting to defend themselves at all. In one case, the magistrates and other principal inhabitants of a town came out to meet him at a distance of 2 days' journey from them, bringing with them the keys of the town and a great quantity of magnificent presents, all of which they laid at the conqueror's feet, and implored his mercy. There was one town which Genghis' force took by a kind of stratagem. A certain engineer, whom he employed to make a reconnaissance of the fortifications, reported that there was a place on one side of the town where there was a ditch full of water outside of the wall, which made the access to the wall there so difficult that the garrison would not be at all likely to expect an attack on that side. The engineer proposed a plan for building some light bridges, which the soldiers were to throw over the ditch in the night, after having drawn off the attention of the garrison to some other quarter, and then mounting upon the walls by means of ladders to get into the town. This plan was adopted. The bridges and the ladders were prepared, and then, when the appointed night came, a feigned attack was made in the opposite part of the town. The garrison were then all called off to repel this pretended attack, and in this way the wall opposite to the ditch was left undefended. The soldiers then threw the bridges over the ditch and planted the ladders against the wall, and before the garrison could get intelligence of what they were doing, they had made their way into the town, and had opened one of the gates, and by this means the whole army got in. The engineer himself, who had proposed the plan, went up first on the first ladder that was planted against the wall. To take the lead in such an escalade required great coolness and courage, for it was dark, and no one knew in going up the ladder how many enemies he might have to encounter at the top of it. The next place which the army of Genghis approached was a quiet and beautiful town, the seat of several institutions of learning, and the residence of learned men and men of leisure. It was a very pleasant place, full of fountains, gardens, and delightful pleasure grounds, with many charming public and private promenades. The name of this place was Tukat, and the beauty and attractiveness of it were proverbial through all the country. Tukat was a place rather of pleasure than of strength, and yet it was surrounded by a wall, and the governor of it determined to make an effort to defend it. The garrison fought bravely, and they kept the besiegers off for 3 days. At the end of that time the engines of the Mongols had made so many breaches in the walls that the governor was convinced that they would soon get in, and so he sent to Genghis to ask for the terms on which he would allow them to surrender. Genghis replied that he would not now make any terms with him at all. It was too late. He ought to have surrendered at the beginning. So the Mongol army forced its way into the town and slaughtered the whole garrison without mercy. Genghis then ordered all the inhabitants, men, women, and children, to repair to a certain place on the plain outside the walls. In obedience to this command, all the people went to the appointed place. They went with fear and trembling, expecting that they were all to be killed. But they found in the end that the object of Genghis in bringing them thus out of the town was not to kill them, but only to call them away from the houses, so that the soldiers could plunder them more conveniently while the owners were away. After being kept out of the town for a time, they were allowed to return, and when they went back to their houses, they found that they had been pillaged and stripped of everything that the soldiers could carry away. There was another large and important town named Kogend. It was situated 200 or 300 miles to the northward of Samarkand on the river Sur, which flows into Aral Lake. The governor of this city was Timur Melek. He was a very powerful chieftain and a man of great military renown, having often been in active service under the Sultan as one of the principal generals of his army. When Timur heard of the fall of Tukat, he presumed that his city of Kogend would be next attacked, as it seemed to come next in the way of the Mongol army. So he began to make vigorous preparations for defense. He broke up all the roads leading toward the town and destroyed the bridges. He also laid in great supplies of food to maintain the inhabitants in case of a protracted siege, and he ordered all the corn, fruits, and cattle of the surrounding country, which he did not require for this purpose, to be taken away and stowed in secret places at a distance, to prevent their falling into the hands of the enemy. Jughi did not himself attack this town, but sent a large detachment under the orders of a general named Elak Nevian. Elak advanced toward the city and commenced his operations. The first thing that was to be done was to rebuild a bridge over the river, so as to enable him to gain access to the town, which was on the opposite bank. Then he set up immense engines at different points along the line, some of which were employed to batter down the walls, and others, at the same time, to throw stones, darts, and arrows over the parapets, in order to drive the garrison back from them. These engines did great execution. Those built to batter down the walls were of great size and power. Some of them, it was said, threw stones over the wall as big as millstones. Timur Melek was equally active in the defense of the town. He built a number of flat-bottomed boats, which might be called floating batteries, since they were constructed for throwing missiles of all sorts into the camp of the enemy. These batteries, it is said, were covered over the top to protect the men, and they had portholes in the sides, like a modern man-of-war, out of which, not cannonballs and bombshells indeed, but arrows, darts, javelins, and stones were projected. The boats were sent out, some on the upper side of the town and some on the lower, and were placed in stations where they could most effectually reach the Mongols' works. They were the means of killing and wounding great multitudes of men, and they greatly disturbed and hindered the besiegers' operations. Still Elak persevered. He endeavored to shut up the city on every side as closely as possible. But there was on one side a large morass or jungle which he could not guard, and Timur received a great many reinforcements to take the place of the men who were killed on the walls by that way. In the meantime, however, Elak was continually receiving reinforcements too from Prince Jughi, who was not at a great distance, and thus the struggle was continued with great fury. At last Timur contrived an ingenious stratagem by which he hoped to cause his enemy to fall into a snare. It seems that there was a small island in the river, not far from the walls of the city, on which, before the siege commenced, Timur had built a fortress, to be held as a sort of advanced post, and had garrisoned the fortress with about 1,000 men. Timur now, in order to divert the attention of the Mongols from the city itself, sent a number of men out from the city who pretended to be deserters, and went immediately to the Mongol camp. Of course, Elak questioned them about the defenses of the city, in order to learn where the weak points were for him to attack. The pretended deserters advised him to attack this fortress on the island, saying that it could very easily be taken, and that its situation was such that, when it was taken, the city itself must surrender, for it completely commanded the place. So Elak caused his principal engines to be removed to the bank of the river, opposite the island, and employed all his energies and spent all his ammunition in shooting at the fortress. But the river was so wide, and the walls of the fortress were so thick and so high, that he made very little impression. At last his whole supply of stones, for stones served in those days instead of cannonballs, was exhausted, and as the town was situated in an alluvial district in which no stones were to be found, he was obliged to send 10 or 12 miles to the upland to procure a fresh supply of ammunition. All this consumed much time, and enabled the garrison to recruit themselves a great deal, and to strengthen their defenses. The operations of the siege were in a great measure suspended while the men were obtaining a new supply of stones, and the whole disposable force of the army was employed in going back and forth to bring them. At length an immense quantity were collected, but then the Mongol general changed his plan. Instead of throwing the stones from his engines toward the fortress on the island, which it had been proved was beyond his reach, he determined to build out a jetty into the river towards it, so as to get a standpoint for his engines nearer the walls, where they could have some chance of doing execution. So he set his men at work to prepare fascines and bundles and rafts of timber, which were to be loaded with the stones and sunk in the river to form the foundation for the proposed bank. The men would bring the stones down to the bank in their hands, and then horsemen who were ready on the brink would take them, and resting them on the saddle, would drive their horses in until they came near the place where the stones were to go, when they would throw them down, and then return for others. In this way they would work upon the jetty in many parts at once, some being employed in building at the end, where it abutted on the shore, while the horsemen were laying the foundations at the same time out in the middle of the stream. The work of the horsemen was very difficult and dangerous, on account of holes in the sandy bottom of the river, into which they were continually sinking. Besides this, the garrison on the walls were doing their utmost all the time to impede the work by shooting arrows, javelins, stones, and fiery darts among the workmen, by which means vast numbers, both of men and horses, were killed. The Mongols, however, persevered, and notwithstanding all the opposition which the garrison made, they succeeded in advancing the mole which they were building so far that Timur was convinced that they would soon gain so advantageous a position that it would be impossible for him to hold out against them. So he determined to attempt to make his escape. His plan was to embark on board his boats with all his men and go down the river in the night. In order to prepare for this undertaking, he employed his men secretly in building more boats, until he had in all more than 70. These boats were kept out of sight, in hidden places in the river, until all were ready. Each of them was covered with a sort of heavy awning or roof made of wet felt, which was plastered over a coating of clay and vinegar. This covering was intended both to defend the men from missiles and the boats themselves from being set on fire. There was one obstacle to the escape of the boats, which it was necessary to remove beforehand, and that was the bridge which the Mongols had built across the river, just below the town, when they first came to besiege it. To destroy this bridge, Timur one night made a sally from one of the gates, and attacked the men who were stationed to guard the bridge. At the same time, he sent down the current of the river a number of great flat-bottomed boats, filled with combustibles of various kinds, mixed with tar and naphtha. These combustibles were set on fire before they were launched, and as the current of the river bore them down one after another against the bridge, they set the wooden piers and posts that supported it on fire, while the guard, being engaged with the party which had sallied from the town, could not go extinguish the flames, and thus the bridge was consumed. The way being thus opened, Timur Melek very soon afterward embarked his family and the greater part of his army on board the boats in the night, and while the Mongols had no suspicion of what was going on, the boats were launched and sent off one after another swiftly down the stream. Before morning came, all traces of the party had passed away. Very soon, however, the Mongol general heard how his intended prey had escaped him, and he immediately sent off a strong detachment to follow the southern bank of the river and pursue the fugitives. The detachment soon overtook them, and then a furious battle ensued between the Mongol horsemen on the banks and in the margin of the water, and the men in the boats, who kept the boats all the time as near as possible to the northern shore. Sometimes, however, when the stream was narrow, or when a rocky point projected from the northern shore so as to drive the boats nearer to the Mongol side, the battle became very fierce and bloody. the Mongols drove their horses far into the water, so as to be as near as possible to the boats, and threw arrows, javelins, and fiery darts at them, while the Mohammedans defended themselves as well as they could from their windows or portholes. Things went on this way for some time, until at length the boats arrived at a part of the river where the water was so shallow, being obstructed by sandbars and shoals, that the boats fell aground. There was nothing now for Timur to do but to abandon the boats and escape with his men to the land. This he succeeded in doing, and after reaching the shore he was able to form his men in array on an elevated piece of ground before Elak could bring up a sufficient number of men to attack him. When the Mongols at length came to attack him, he beat them off in the first instance, but he was obliged soon afterwards to leave the field and continue his retreat. Of course he was hotly pursued by the Mongols. His men became rapidly thinned in number, some being killed, and others getting separated from the main body in the confusion of the flight, until, at last, Timur was left almost alone. At last he was himself on the very point of being taken. There were 3 Mongols closely pursuing him. He turned round and shot an arrow at the foremost of the pursuers. The arrow struck the Mongol in the eye. The agony which the wounded man felt was so great that the 2 others stopped to assist him, and in the meantime Timur got out of the way. In due time, and after meeting with some other hairbreadth escapes, he reached the camp of the Sultan, who received him very joyfully, loaded him with praises for the indomitable spirit which he had evinced, and immediately made him governor of another city. In the meantime, some of the boats which had been abandoned by the soldiers were got off by the men who had been left in charge of them, one especially which contained the family of Timur. This boat went quietly down the river and conveyed the family to a place of safety. The city of Kojend, from which Timur and his men had fled, was, of course, now without any means of defense, and it surrendered the very next day to the Mongols. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The History of Genghis Khan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The History of Genghis Khan by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 21. Death of the Sultan, 1220. In the meantime, while Juki and the other generals were ravaging the country with their detachments, and besieging and capturing all the secondary towns and fortresses that came in their way, as related in the last chapter, Genghis Khan himself, with the main body of the army, had advanced to Samarkand in pursuit of the Sultan, who had, as he supposed, taken shelter there. Samarkand was the capital of the country, and was then, as it has been since, a great and renowned city. Besides the Sultan himself, whom Genghis Khan was pursuing, there were the ladies of his family, whom he wished also to capture. The 2 principal ladies were the Sultana and the Queen Mother. The Queen Mother was a lady of very great distinction. She had been greatly renowned during the lifetime of her husband, the former Sultan, for her learning, her piety, the kindness of her heart, and the general excellence of her character, so far as her dealings with her subjects and friends were concerned, and her influence throughout the realm had been unbounded. At some periods of her life she had exercised a great deal of political power, and at one time she bore the very grand title of Protectress of the Faith of the World. She exercised the power which she then possessed, in the main, in a very wise and beneficial manner. She administered justice impartially. She protected the weak, and restrained the oppressions of the strong. She listened to all the cases which were brought before her with great attention and patience, and arrived almost always at just conclusions respecting them. With all this, however, she was very strict and severe, and, as has almost always been the case with women raised to the possession of irresponsible power, she was unrelenting and cruel in the extreme whenever, as she judged, any political necessity required her to act with decision. Her name was Khatun. Khatun was not now at Samarcand. She was at Kharazm, a city which was the chief residence of the court. She had been living there in retirement ever since the death of her husband, the present Sultan's father. Samarcand itself, as has already been said, was a great and splendid city. Like most of the other cities, it was enclosed in a double wall, though in this case the outer wall surrounded the whole city, while the inner one enclosed the mosque, the palace of the Sultan, and some other public buildings. These walls were much better built and more strongly fortified than those of Bokhara. There were 12 iron gates, it is said, in the outer wall. These gates were a league apart from each other. At every 2 leagues along the wall was a fort capable of containing a large body of men. The walls were likewise strengthened with battlements and towers, in which the men could fight under shelter, and they were surrounded by a broad and deep ditch to prevent an army from approaching too near to them, in order to undermine them or batter them down. The city was abundantly supplied with water by means of hydraulic constructions, as perfect and complete as could be made in those days. The water was brought by leaden pipes from a stream which came down from the mountains at some distance from the town. It was conveyed by these pipes to every part of the town, and was distributed freely, so that every great street had a little current of water running through it, and every house a fountain in the court or garden. Besides this, in a public square or park, there was a mound where the water was made to spout up in the center, and then flow down in little rivulets and cascades on every side. The gates and towers, which have been described, were in the outer wall, and beyond them, in the environs, were a great many fields, gardens, orchards, and beautifully cultivated grounds, which produced fruits of all sorts, that were sent by the merchants into all the neighboring countries. At a little distance the town was almost entirely concealed from view by these gardens and orchards, there being nothing to be seen but minarets, and some of the loftier roofs of the houses rising above the tops of the trees. There were so many people who flocked into Samarcand from the surrounding country for shelter and protection, when they learned that Genghis Khan was coming, that the place would hardly contain them. In addition to these, the Sultan sent over 100,000 troops to defend the town, with 30 generals to command them. There were 20 large elephants, too, that were brought with the army to be employed in any service which might be required of them during the siege. This army, however, instead of entering the city at once, encamped about it. They strengthened the position of the camp by a deep ditch which they dug, throwing up the earth from the ditch on the side toward the camp, so as to form a redoubt with which to defend the ground from the Mongols. But as soon as Genghis Khan arrived, they were speedily driven from this post and forced to take shelter within the walls of the city. Here they defended themselves with so much vigor and resolution that Genghis Khan would probably have found it very difficult to take the town, had it not been for dissensions within the walls. It seems that the rich merchants and other wealthy men of the city, being convinced that the place would sooner or later fall into the hands of the Mongols, thought it would be better to surrender it at once, while they were in a condition to make some terms by which they might hope to save their lives and perhaps their property. But the generals would not listen to any proposition of this kind. They had been sent by the Sultan to defend the town, and they felt bound in honor, in obedience to their orders, to fight in defense of it to the last extremity. The dissension within the city grew more and more violent every day, until at length The party of the inhabitants grew so strong and decided that they finally took possession of one of the gates and sent a large deputation consisting of priests, magistrates, and some of the principal citizens to Genghis Khan, bearing with them the keys of the town, and proposing to deliver them up to him if he would spare the garrison and the inhabitants. But he said he would make no terms except with those who were of their party and were willing to surrender. In respect to the generals and the soldiers of the garrison, he would make no promises. The deputation gave up the keys, and Genghis Khan entered the city. The inhabitants were spared, but the soldiers were massacred whenever they could be found. A great many perished in the streets. A considerable body of them, however, with the governor at their head, retreated within the inner wall, and there defended themselves desperately for 4 days. At the end of that time, finding that their case was hopeless, and knowing that they could expect no quarter from the Mongols in any event, they resolved to make a sally and cut their way through the ranks of their enemies at all hazards. The governor, accordingly, put himself at the head of a troop of 1,000 horse, and coming out suddenly from his retreat, he dashed through the camp at a time when the Mongols were off their guard, and so gained the open country and made his escape. All the soldiers that remained behind in the city were immediately put to the sword. In the meantime, the Sultan himself, finding that his affairs were going to ruin, retreated from province to province, accompanied by as large a force as he could keep together, and vainly seeking to find some place of safety. He had several sons, and among them 2 whose titles were Jalaloddin and Kothbaddin. Jalaloddin was the oldest, and was therefore naturally entitled to be his father's successor. But for some reason or other, the Queen Mother, Khatun, had taken a dislike to him, and had persuaded her son, the Sultan, to execute a sort of act or deed by which Jalaloddin was displaced, and Kothbaddin, who was a great favorite of hers, was made heir to the throne in his place. The Sultan had other sons who were governors of different provinces, and he fled from one to another of these, seeking in vain for some safe retreat. But he could find none. He was hunted from place to place by detachments of the Mongols, and the number of his attendants and followers was continually diminishing, until at last he began to be completely discouraged. At length, at one of the cities where he made a short stay, he delivered to an officer named Omar, who was the steward of his household, 10 coffers sealed with the royal signet, with instructions to take them secretly to a certain distant fortress, and lock them up carefully there, without allowing anyone to know that he did it. These coffers contained the royal jewels, and they were of inestimable value. After this, one of his sons joined him with quite a large force, but very soon a large body of Mongols came up, and, after a furious battle, the Sultan's troops were defeated and scattered in all directions, and he was again obliged to fly, accompanied by a very small body of officers, who still contrived to keep near him. With these, he succeeded at last in reaching a very retired town near the Caspian Sea, where he hoped to remain concealed. His strength was now spent, and all his courage gone. He sank down in a condition of the greatest despondency and distress, and spent his time in going to the mosque and offering up prayers to God to save him from total ruin. He made confession of his sins, and promised an entire amendment of life if the Almighty would deliver him from his enemies and restore him to his throne. At last the Mongol detachment that was in pursuit of him in that part of the country were informed by a peasant where he was, and one day, while he was at his prayers in the mosque, word was brought to him that the Mongols were coming. He rushed out of the mosque, and guided by some friends, ran down to the shore and got into a boat, with a view of escaping by sea, all retreat by land being now cut off. He had scarce got on board the boat when the Mongols appeared on the shore. The men in the boat immediately pushed off. The Mongols, full of disappointment and rage, shot at them with their arrows, but the Sultan was not struck by any of them, and was soon out of reach of his pursuers. The Sultan lay in the boat almost helpless, being perfectly exhausted by the terror and distress which he had endured. He soon began to suffer, too, from an intense pain in the chest and side, which gradually became so severe that he could scarcely breathe. The men with him in the boat, finding that he was seriously sick, made the best of their way to a small island named Abbott, which is situated near the southeastern corner of the sea. Here they pitched a tent and made up a bed in it, as well as they could, for the sufferer. They also sent a messenger to the shore to bring off a physician secretly. The physician did all that was in his power, but it was too late. The inflammation and the pain subsided after a time, but it was evident that the patient was sinking, and that he was about to die. It happened that the Sultan's son, Jalaloddin, the one who had been set aside in favor of his brother Kothboddin, was at this time on the mainland not far from the island, and intelligence was communicated to him of his father's situation. He immediately went to the island to see him, taking with him 2 of his brothers. They were obliged to manage the business very secretly, to prevent the Mongols from finding out what was going on. On the arrival of Jalaloddin, the Sultan expressed great satisfaction in seeing him, and he revoked the decree by which he had been superseded in the succession. "You, my son," said he, "are, after all, the one among all my children who is best able to revenge me on the Mongols. Therefore I revoke the act which I formerly executed at the request of the Queen, my mother, in favor of Kothboddin." He then solemnly appointed Jalaloddin to be his successor, and enjoined upon the other princes to be obedient and faithful to him as their sovereign. He also formally delivered to him his sword as the emblem and badge of the supreme power which he thus conferred upon him. Soon after this the Sultan expired. The attendants buried the body secretly on the island for fear of the Mongols. They washed it carefully before the interment, according to custom, and then put on again a portion of the same dress which the Sultan had worn when living, having no means of procuring or making any other shroud. As for Khatun, the Queen Mother, when she heard the tidings of her son's death, and was informed at the same time that her favorite Kothboddin had been set aside, and Jalaloddin, whom she hated, and who, she presumed, hated her, had been made his successor, she was in a great rage. She was at that time at Kharazm, which was the capital, and she attempted to persuade the officers and soldiers near her not to submit to the Sultan's decree, but to make Kothboddin their sovereign after all. While she was engaged in forming this conspiracy, the news reached the city that the Mongols were coming. Khatun immediately determined to flee to save her life. She had, it seems, in her custody at Kharazm 12 children, the sons of various princes that reigned in different parts of the empire or in the environs of it. These children were either held as hostages, or had been made captive in insurrections and wars, and were retained in prison as a punishment to their fathers. The Queen Mother found that she could not take these children with her, and so she ordered them all to be slain. She was afraid that the Mongols, when they came, might set them free. As soon as she was gone, the city fell into great confusion on account of the struggles for power between the 2 parties of Jalaloddin and Kothboddin. But the Sultana, who had made the mischief, did not trouble herself to know how it would end. Her only anxiety was to save her own life. After various wanderings and adventures, she at last found her way into a very retired district of country lying on the southern shore of the Caspian, between the mountains and the sea, and here she sought refuge in a castle or fortress named Ilan, where she thought she was secure from all pursuit. She brought with her to the castle her jewels and all her most valuable treasures. But Genghis Khan had spies in every part of the country, and he was soon informed where cotton was concealed. So he sent a messenger to a certain Mongol general named Huba Nevian, who was commanding a detachment in that part of the country, informing him that cotton was in the castle of Ilan, and commanding him to go and lay siege to it, and to take it at all hazards, and to bring cotton to him either dead or alive. Huba immediately set off for the castle. The Queen Mother, however, had notice of his approach, and the lords who were with her urged her to fly. If she would go with them, they said, they would take her to Jalaloddin, and he would protect her. But she would not listen to any such proposal. She hated Jalaloddin so intensely that she would not, even to save her life, put herself under his power. The very worst possible treatment, she said, that she could receive from the Mongols would be more agreeable to her than the greatest favors from the hand of Jalaloddin. The ground of this extreme animosity which she felt toward Jalaloddin was not any personal animosity to him. It arose simply from an ancient and long-continued dislike and hatred which she had borne against his mother. So Khatun refused to retire from the danger, and soon afterward the horde of Mongols arrived and pitched their camp before the castle walls. For 3 months Huba and his Mongols continued to ply the walls of the fortress with battering rams and other engines in order to force their way in, but in vain. The place was too strong for them. At length Genghis Khan, hearing how the case stood, sent word to them to give up the attempt to make a breach, and to invest the place closely on all sides, so as to allow no person to go out or to come in. In that way, he said, the garrison would soon be starved into a surrender. When the governor of the castle saw, by the arrangements which Huba made in obedience to this order, that this was the course that was to be pursued, he said he was not uneasy, for his magazines were full of provisions, and as to water, the rain which fell very copiously there among the mountains always afforded an abundant supply. But the governor was mistaken in his calculations in respect to the rain. It usually fell very frequently in that region, but after the blockade of the fortress commenced, for 3 weeks there was not the smallest shower. The people of the country around thought this failure of the rain was a special judgment of heaven against the Queen for the murder of the children and for her various other crimes. It was, indeed, remarkable, for in ordinary times the rain was so frequent that the people of all that region depended upon it entirely for their supply of water, and never found it necessary to search for springs or to dig wells. The sufferings of the people within the fortress for want of water were very great. Many of them died in great misery, and at length the provisions began to fail too, and Khatun was compelled to allow the governor to surrender. The Mongols immediately seized the queen and took possession of all her treasures. They also took captive all the lords and ladies who had attended her, and the women of her household, and 2 or 3 of her great-grandchildren whom she had brought with her in her flight. All these persons were sent under a strong guard to Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan retained the queen as a captive for some time, and treated her in a very cruel and barbarous manner. He would sometimes order her to be brought into his tent at the end of his dinner, that he might enjoy his triumph by insulting and deriding her. On these occasions he would throw her scraps of food from the table as if she had been a dog. He took away the children from her too, all but one, whom he left with her a while to comfort her, as he said. But one day an officer came and seized this one from her very arms, while she was dressing him and combing his hair. This last blow caused her a severer pang than any that she had before endured, and left her utterly disconsolate and heartbroken. Some accounts say that soon after this she was put to death, but others state that Genghis Khan retained her several years as a captive, and carried her to and fro in triumph in his train through the countries over which she had formerly reigned with so much power and splendor. She deserved her sufferings, it is true, but Genghis Khan was none the less guilty on that account for treating her so cruelly. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of the History of Genghis Khan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The History of Genghis Khan by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 22, Victorious Campaigns, 1220 to 1221. After this, Genghis Khan went on successfully for several years, extending his conquests over all the western part of Central Asia, while the generals whom he had left at home were extending his dominions in the same manner in the eastern portion. He overran nearly all of Persia, went entirely around the Caspian Sea, and even approached the confines of India. In this expedition toward India, he was in pursuit of Jalaloddin. Immediately after the death of his father, Jalaloddin had done all in his power to raise an army and carry on the war against Genghis Khan. He met with a great deal of embarrassment and difficulty at first, on account of the plots and conspiracies which his grandmother had organized in favor of his brother Kothboddin, and the dissensions among his people to which they gave rise. At last, in the course of a year, he succeeded in some measure in healing this breach and in raising an army. And though he was not strong enough to fight the Mongols in a general battle, he hung about them in their march and harassed them in various ways, so as to impede their operations very essentially. Genghis Khan from time to time sent off detachments from his army to take him. He was often defeated in the engagements which ensued, but he always succeeded in saving himself and in keeping together a portion of his men, and thus he maintained himself in the field, though he was growing weaker and weaker all the time. At last he became completely discouraged, and after signal defeat, which he met with from a detachment which had been sent against him by Genghis Khan, he went, with the few troops that remained together, to a strong fortress among the mountains, and told the governor that it seemed to him useless to continue the struggle any longer, and that he had come to shut himself up in the fortress and abandon the contest in despair. The governor, however, told him that it was not right for a prince, the descendant of ancestors so illustrious as his, and the inheritor of so resplendent a crown, to yield to discouragement and despondency on account of the reverses of fortune. He advised him again to take the field, and to raise a new army and continue the contest to the end. Jalaloddin determined to follow this advice, and after a brief period of repose at the castle, he again took the field. He made great exertions, and finally succeeded in getting together about 20,000 men. This was a small force, it is true, compared with the numbers of the enemy, but it was sufficient, if well managed, to enable the prince to undertake operations of considerable importance, and Jalaloddin began to feel somewhat encouraged again. With his 20,000 men, he gained 1 or 2 victories too, which encouraged him still more. In one of these cases he defeated rather a singular stratagem which the Mongol general contrived. It seems that the Mongol detachment which was sent out in this instance against Jalaloddin was not strong enough, and the general, in order to make Jalaloddin believe that his force was greater than it really was, ordered all the felt caps and cloaks that there were in the army to be stuffed with straw, and placed on the horses and camels of the baggage, in order to give the appearance of a second line of reserve in the rear of the line of real soldiers. This was to induce Jalaloddin to surrender without fighting. But in some way or other Jalaloddin detected the deceit, and instead of surrendering, fought the Mongols with great vigor and defeated them. He gained a very decided victory, and perhaps this might have been the beginning of a change of fortune for him if, unfortunately, his generals had not quarreled about the division of the spoil. There was a beautiful Arabian horse which two of his leading generals desired to possess, and each claimed it. The dispute became at last so violent that one of the generals struck the other in his face with the lash of his whip. Upon this the feud became a deadly one. Both parties appealed to Jalaloddin. He did not wish to make either general an enemy by deciding in favor of the other, and so he tried to compromise the matter. He did not succeed in doing this, and one of the generals, mortally offended, went off in the night, taking with him all that portion of the troops which was under his command. Jalaloddin did everything in his power to bring the disaffected general back again, but before he could accomplish this purpose, Genghis Khan came up with a large force between the two parties, and prevented their effecting a junction. Jalaloddin had now no alternative but to retreat. Genghis Khan followed him, and it was in this way that, after a time, both the armies reached the banks of the Indus, on the borders of India. Jalaloddin, being closely pursued, took his position in a narrow defile near the bank of the river, and here a great battle was fought among the rocks and precipices. Jalaloddin, it is said, had only 30,000 men at his command, while Genghis Khan was at the head of an army of 300,000. The numbers in both cases are probably greatly exaggerated, but the proportion may perhaps be true. It was only a small portion of the Mongol army that could get into the defile where the Sultan's troops had posted themselves, and so desperately did the latter fight that it is said they killed 20,000 of the Mongols before they gave in. In fact, they fought like wild beasts, with desperate and unremitting fury, all day long. Toward night, it became evident to Jalaloddin that it was all over with him. A large portion of his followers were killed. Some had made their escape across the river, though many of those who sought to do so were drowned in the attempt. The rest of his men were completely exhausted and discouraged, and wholly unable to renew the contest on the following day. Jalaloddin had exposed himself very freely in the fight, in hopes perhaps that he should be killed, but Genghis Khan had given positive orders that he should be taken alive. He had even appointed 2 of his generals to watch carefully, and to see that no person should, under any circumstances, kill him. He wished to take him alive, in order to lead him through the country a prisoner, and exhibit him to his former subjects as a trophy of his victory, just as he had done and was still doing with the old Queen Khatun, his grandmother. But Jalaloddin was determined that his conqueror should not enjoy this pleasure. He resolved to attempt to save himself by swimming the river. He accordingly went first, breathless and covered with dust and blood from the fight, to take a hurried leave of his mother, his wives, and his children, who, as was customary in those countries and times, had accompanied him in his campaign. He found them in his tent, full of anxiety and terror. He took leave of them with much sorrow and many tears, trying to comfort them with the hope that they should meet again in happier times. Then he took off his armor and his arms, in order that he might not be impeded in crossing the river, reserving, however, his sword and bow, and a quiver full of arrows. He then mounted a fresh horse, and rode toward the river. When he reached the bank of the river, the horse found the current so rapid, and the agitation of the water so great, that he was very unwilling to advance. But Jalaloddin spurred him in. Indeed, there was no time to be lost, for scarcely had he reached the shore when Genghis Khan himself and a party of Mongols appeared in view, advancing to seize him. They stopped on the bank when they saw Jalaloddin ride into the water among the rocks and whirlpools. They did not dare to follow him, but they remained at the waterside to see how his perilous adventure would end. As soon as Jalaloddin found that he was out of their reach, he stopped at a place where his horse found a foothold, and turned round toward his pursuers with looks of hatred and defiance. He then drew his bow and began to shoot at them with his arrows, and he continued to shoot until all the arrows in his quiver were exhausted. Some of the more daring of the Mongols proposed to Genghis Khan that they should swim out and try to take him, but Genghis Khan would not allow them to go. He said the attempt would be useless. "You can do nothing at all with him," said he. "A man of such cool and determined bravery as that will defy and defeat all your attempts. Any father might be proud to have such a son, and any son proud to be descended from such a father." When his arrows were all expended, Jalaloddin took to the river again, and his horse, after a series of most desperate struggles among the whirlpools and eddies and the boiling surges which swept around the rocks, succeeded at length in carrying his master over. The progress of the horse was watched with great interest by Genghis Khan and his party from the shore as long as they could see him. As soon as Jalaloddin landed and had recovered a little from the fatigue and excitement of the passage, he began to look around him and to consider what was next to be done. He found himself entirely alone in a wild and solitary place, which he had reason to fear was infested with tigers and other ferocious beasts of prey, such as haunt the jungles in India. Night was coming on too, and there were no signs of any habitations or of any shelter. So he fastened his horse at the foot of a tree and climbed up himself among the branches, and in this way passed the night. The next morning he came down and began to walk along the bank of the river to see what he could find. He was in a state of great anxiety and distress. Suddenly, to his great relief and joy, he came upon a small troop of soldiers, accompanied by some officers who had escaped across the river from the battle as he had done. 3 of these officers were his particular friends, and he was overjoyed to see them. They had made their way across the river in a boat, which they had found upon the bank at the beginning of the defeat of the army. They had spent the whole night in the boat, being in great danger from the shoals and shelving rocks, and from the impetuosity of the current. Finally, toward morning, they had landed, not far from the place where Jalaloddin found them. Not long after this, he came upon a troop of 300 horsemen, who had escaped by swimming the river at a place where the water was more smooth, at some distance below. These men told him that about 6 miles farther down the stream there was a body of about 4,000 men who had made their escape in a similar manner. On assembling these men, Jalaloddin found himself once more at the head of a considerable force. The immediate wants of his men were, however, extremely pressing, for they were all wholly destitute of food and of every other necessary, and Jalaloddin would have been greatly embarrassed to provide for them had it not been for the thoughtfulness and fidelity of one of the officers of his household on the other side of the river. This officer's name was Jamalarrazad. As soon as he found that his master had crossed the river, knowing too that a great number of the troops had attempted to cross besides, and that in all probability many of them had succeeded in reaching the other bank, who would all be greatly in want of provisions and stores the next morning, he went to work at once during the night and loaded a very large boat with provisions, arms, money, and stuff to make clothing for the soldiers. He succeeded in getting off in this boat before his plan was discovered by the Mongols, and in the course of the next morning he reached the opposite bank with it, and thus furnished to Jalaloddin an abundant provision for his immediate necessities. Jalal-ad-Din was so much pleased with the conduct of Jamal Arazad in this affair that he appointed him at once to a very high and responsible office in his service, and gave him a new title of honor. In the meantime, Genghis Khan, on the other side of the river, took possession the next morning of Jalal-ad-Din's camp. Of course, the family of the Sultan fell into his hands. The emperor ordered all the males to be killed, but he reserved the women for a different fate. Among the persons killed was a boy about 8 years old, Jalal-ad-Din's oldest son. Jalal-ad-Din had ordered his treasure to be sunk in the river, intending probably to come back and recover it at some future time. But Genghis Khan found out in some way where it was sunk, and he sent divers down for it, and thus obtained possession of it as a part of his booty. After this, Jalal-ad-Din remained 5 or 6 years in India, where he joined himself and his army with some of the princes of that country, and fought many campaigns there. At length, when a favorable opportunity occurred, he came back to his own country, and fought some time longer against the Mongols there, but he never succeeded in gaining possession of any substantial power. Genghis Khan continued after this for 2 or 3 years in the Mohammedan countries of the western part of Asia, and extended his conquests there in every direction. It is not necessary to follow his movements in detail. It would only be a repetition of the same tale of rapine, plunder, murder, and devastation. Sometimes a city would surrender at once, when the conqueror approached the gates, by sending out a deputation of the magistrates and other principal inhabitants with the keys of the city, and with magnificent presents, in hopes to appease him. And they usually so far succeeded in this as to put the Mongol soldiery in good humor, so that they would content themselves with ransacking and plundering the place, leaving the inhabitants alive. At other times the town would attempt to resist. The Mongols would then build engines to batter down the walls, and to hurl great stones over among the besieged. In many instances there was great difficulty in obtaining a sufficient supply of stones, on account of the alluvial character of the ground on which the city stood. In such cases, after the stones found near were exhausted, the besiegers would cut down great trees from the avenues leading to the town, or from the forest near, and, sawing the trunk up into short lengths, would use the immense blocks thus formed as ammunition for the engines. These great logs of heavy wood, when thrown over the walls, were capable of doing almost as much execution as the stones, though, compared with a modern bombshell, a monstrous ball of iron, which, after flying 4 or 5 miles from the battery, leaving on its way a fiery train through the air, descends into a town and bursts into 1,000 fragments, which fly like iron hail in every direction around. They were very harmless missiles. In sawing up the trunks of the trees into logs, and in bringing stones for the engines, the Mongols employed the prisoners whom they had taken in war and made slaves of. The amount of work of this kind which was to be done at some of the sieges was very great. It is said that at the siege of Nishabur, a town whose inhabitants greatly offended Genghis Khan by secretly sending arms, provisions, and money to Jalal-ad-Din, after they had once surrendered to the Mongols and pretended to be friendly to them, the army of the Mongols employed 1,200 of these engines, all of which were made at a town at some distance from the place besieged, and were then transported in parts by the slaves, and put together by them under the walls. While the slaves were employed in works of this kind, they were sometimes protected by wooden shields covered with rawhides, which were carried before them by other slaves, to keep off and extinguish the fiery darts and arrows which were shot at them from the wall. Sometimes, too, the places where the engines were set up were protected by wooden bulwarks, which, together with the framework itself of the engines, were covered with rawhides to prevent their being set on fire by the enemy. The number of raw hides required for this purpose was immense, and to obtain them the Mongols slaughtered vast herds of horses and cattle, which they plundered from the enemy. In order to embarrass the enemy in respect to ammunition for their engines, the people of a town, when they heard that the Mongols were coming, used to turn out sometimes in mass several days before, and gather up all the stones they could find and throw them into the river, or otherwise put them out of the way. In some cases, the towns that were threatened, as has already been said, did not attempt to resist, but submitted at once, and cast themselves on the mercy of the conqueror. In such cases the Mongol generals usually spared the lives of the inhabitants, though they plundered their property. It sometimes happened, too, that after attempting to defend themselves for some time, the garrison would become discouraged, and then would attempt to make some terms or conditions with the conqueror before they surrendered. In these cases, however, the terms which the Mongols insisted upon were often so hard that, rather than yield to them, the garrison would go on fighting to the end. In one instance there lived a town that was to be assailed a certain sheik or prince named Kubru, who was a man of very exalted character as well as of high distinction. The Mongol general whom Genghis Khan had commissioned to take the town was his third son, Oktay. Oktay had heard of the fame of the sheik, and had conceived a very high respect for him. So he sent a herald to the wall with a passport for the sheik, and for 10 other persons, such as he should choose, giving him free permission to leave the town and go wherever he pleased. But the sheik declined the offer. Then Oktay sent in another passport, with permission to the sheik to take 1,000 men with him. But he still refused. He could not accept Oktay's bounty, he said, unless it was extended to all the Mohammedans in the town. He was obliged to take his lot with the rest, for he was bound to his people by ties too strong to be easily sundered. So the siege went on, and at the end of it, when the town was carried, the sheik was slain with the rest in the streets, where he stood his ground to the last, fighting like a lion. All the Mohammedan chieftains, however, did not possess so noble a spirit as this. One chieftain, when he found that the Mongols were coming, caused himself to be let down with ropes from the wall in the night, and so made his escape, leaving the town and the garrison to their fate. The garrisons of the towns, knowing that they had little mercy to expect from their terrible enemies, fought often very desperately to the last, as they would have done against beasts of prey. They would suddenly open the gates and rush out in large bands, provided with combustibles of all kinds and torches, with which they would set fire to the engines of the besiegers, and then get back again within the walls before the Mongols could recover sufficiently from the alarm and confusion to intercept them. In this manner they destroyed a great many of the engines, and killed vast numbers of men. Still the Mongols would persevere, and sooner or later the place was sure to fall. Then, when the inhabitants found that all hope was over, they had become so desperate in their hatred of their foes that they would sometimes set the town on fire with their own hands, and throw themselves and their wives and children into the flames, rather than fall into the hands of their infuriated enemies. The cruelties which the Mongols perpetrated upon their unhappy victims when, after a long resistance, they finally gained possession of a town were indeed dreadful. They usually ordered all the people to come out to an open space on the plain, and there, after taking out all the young and able-bodied men who could be made useful in bringing stones and setting up engines and other such labors, and also all the young and beautiful women, to be divided among the army or sold as slaves, they would put the rest together in a mass and kill them all by shooting at them with arrows, just as if they had been beasts surrounded in a chase, excepting that the excitement and pleasure of shooting into such a mass of human victims, and of hearing the shrieks and cries of their terror, was probably infinitely greater to their brutal murderers than if it had been a herd of lions, tigers, and wolves that they were destroying. It is said by the historians that in one case the number of people ordered out upon the plain was so great that it took 4 days for them to pass out and assemble at the appointed place, and that after those who were to be spared had been separated from the rest, the number that were left to be slain was over 100,000, as recorded by the secretaries, who made an enumeration of them. In another case the slaughter was so great that it took 12 days to count the number of the dead. Some of the atrocities which were perpetrated upon the prisoners were almost too horrible to be described. In one case a woman, quite advanced in years, begged the Mongols to spare her life, and promised that, if they would do so, she would give them a pearl of great value. They asked her where the pearl was, and she said she had swallowed it. The Mongols then immediately cut her down and ripped her body open with their swords to find the pearl. They found it, and then, encouraged by this success, and thinking it probable that other women might have attempted to hide their jewels in the same way, they proceeded to kill and cut open a great number of women to search for pearls in their bodies, but they found no more. At the siege of a certain city called Bamiyan, a young grandson of Genghis Khan, wishing to please his grandfather by his daring, approached so near the wall that he was reached by an arrow shot by one of the archers and killed. Genghis Khan was deeply affected by this event, and he showed by the bitterness of his grief that, though he was so utterly heartless and cruel in inflicting these woes upon others, he could feel for himself very acutely when it came to his turn to suffer. As for the mother of the child, she was rendered perfectly furious by his death. She thought of nothing but revenge, and she only waited for the town to be taken in order that she might enjoy it. When at last a practicable breach was made, and the soldiers began to pour into the city, she went in with the rest, and insisted that every man, woman, and child should be put to death. Her special rage was directed against the children, whom she seemed to take special pleasure in destroying, in vengeance for the death of her own child. The hatred and rage which she manifested against children extended even to babes unborn, and these feelings she evinced by atrocities too shocking to be described. The opinions which Genghis Khan entertained on religious subjects appear from a conversation which he held at one time during the course of his campaigns in Western Asia with some learned Mohammedan doctors at Bokhara, which was the great seat at that time of science and philosophy. He asked the doctors what were the principles of their religion. They replied that these principles consisted of 5 fundamental points. 1. In believing in one God, the Creator of all things, and the supreme ruler and governor of the universe. 2. In giving 1/40th part of their yearly income or gains to the poor. 3. In praying to God 5 times every day. 4. In setting apart 1 month in each year for fasting. 5. In making a pilgrimage to the temple in Mecca, there to worship God. Genghis Khan told them that he believed himself in the first of these articles, and he approved of the 3 succeeding ones. It was very well, he said, to give 1/40th of one's income to the poor, and to pray to God 5 times a day, and to set apart a month in the year for a fast. But as to the last article, he could not but dissent from it entirely, for the whole world was God's house, and it was ridiculous, he said, to imagine that one place could really be any more fitting than another as a place for worshipping him. The learned doctors were much dissatisfied with this answer. They were, in fact, more displeased with the dissent which the emperor expressed from this last article, the only one which was purely and wholly ritual in its character, than they were gratified with the concurrence which he expressed in all the other 4. This is not at all surprising, for from the times of the Pharisees down to the present day, the spirit of sectarianism and bigotry in religion always plants itself most strongly on the platform of externals. It is always contending strenuously for rights, while it places comparatively in the background all that bears directly on the vital and spiritual interests of the soul. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The History of Genghis Khan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The History of Genghis Khan by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 23, Grand Celebrations, 1221 to 1224. When Genghis Khan found that his conquests in Western Asia were in some good degree established and confirmed, he illustrated his victory and the consequent extension of his empire by two very imposing celebrations. The first was a grand hunt. The second was a solemn convocation of all the estates of his immense realm in a sort of diet or deliberative assembly. The accounts given by the historians of both these celebrations are doubtless greatly exaggerated. Their description of the hunt is as follows. It was after the close of the campaign in 1221 that it took place, while the army were in winter quarters. The object of the hunt was to keep the soldiers occupied, so as to avoid the relaxation of discipline and the vices and disorder which generally creep into a camp where there are no active occupations to engage the minds of the men. The hunt took place in a vast region of uninhabited country, which was infested with wild beasts of every kind. The soldiers were marched out on this expedition in order of war, as if it were a country occupied by armed men that they were going to attack. The different detachments were conducted to the different points in the outskirts of the country, from which they severally extended themselves to the right and left, so as completely to enclose the ground. And the space was so large, it is said, which was thus enclosed, that it took them several weeks to march into the center. It is true that in such a case the men would advance very slowly, perhaps only a few miles each day, in order that they might examine the ground thoroughly, and leave no ravine or thicket or other lurking place where beasts might conceal themselves unexplored. Still, the circle was doubtless immensely large. When the appointed morning at length arrived, the men at the several stations were arrayed, and they commenced their advance toward the center, moving to the sound of trumpets, drums, timbrels, and other such instruments of martial music as were in use in those days. The men were strictly forbidden to kill any animal. They were only to start them out from their lurking places and lairs, and drive them in toward the center of the field. Great numbers of the men were provided with picks, spades, and other similar tools, with which they were to dig out the burrows and holes of such animals as should seek refuge underground. They went on in this way for some weeks. The animals ran before them, thinking, when they were disturbed by the men, that it was only a momentary danger, which they could easily escape from, as usual, by running forward into the next thicket. But soon the advancing line of the soldiers reached them there, and drove them out again. And if they attempted to turn to the right or the left, they soon found themselves intercepted. Thus, as the circle grew narrower, and the space enclosed diminished, the animals began to find themselves mixing with one another in great numbers, and being now irritated and angry, they attacked one another in many instances, the strong falling upon and killing the weak. Thus a great many were killed, though not by the hands of the soldiers. At last the numbers became so great, and the excitement and terror of the animals so intense, that the soldiers had great difficulty in driving them forward. The poor beasts ran this way and that, half distracted, while the soldiers pressed steadily on behind them, and cut them off from every chance of escape by raising terrific shouts and outcries, and by brandishing weapons before them wherever they attempted to turn. At length the animals were all driven into the inner circle, a comparatively small space, which had been previously marked out. Around this space double and triple lines of troops were drawn up, armed with pikes and spears, which they pointed in towards the center, thus forming a sort of wall by which the beasts were closely shut in. The plan was now for the officers and khans, and all the great personages of the court and the army, to go into the circle and show their courage and their prowess by attacking the beasts and slaying them. But the courage required for such an exploit was not so great as it might seem, for it was always found on these occasions that the beasts, though they had been very wild and ferocious when first aroused from their lairs, and had appeared excessively irritated when they found the circle beginning to narrow around them, ended at last in losing all their spirit, and in becoming discouraged, dejected, and tame. This was owing partly, perhaps, to their having become, in some degree, familiar with the sight of men, but more probably to the exhaustion produced by long continued fatigue and excitement, and to their having been for so many days deprived in a great degree of their accustomed food and rest. Thus in this, as in a great many other similar instances, the poor soldiers and common people incurred the danger and the toil, and then the great men came in at the end to reap the glory. Genghis Khan himself was the first to enter the circle for the purpose of attacking the beasts. He was followed by the princes of his family and by other great chieftains and khans. As they went in, the whole army surrounded the enclosure and completely filled the air with the sound of drums, timbrels, trumpets, and other such instruments, and with the noise of the most terrific shouts and outcries which they could make, in order to terrify and overawe the beasts as much as possible, and to destroy in them all thought and hope of resistance. And indeed so much effect was produced by these means of intimidation that the beasts, it is said, became completely stupefied. They were so affrighted that they lost all their fierceness. The lions and tigers became as tame as lambs, and the bears and wild boars, like the most timorous creatures, became dejected and amazed. Still, the going in of Genghis Khan and the princes to attack them was not wholly without danger, for of course it was a point of honor with them to select the most ferocious and fierce of the animals, and some of these, when they found themselves actually assailed, were aroused again, and recovering in some degree their native ferocity, seemed impelled to make a last desperate effort to defend themselves. After killing a few of the lions, tigers, and bears, Genghis Khan and his immediate suite returned to a place at one side of the enclosure, where a throne had been set up for the emperor on an eminence which afforded a good view of the field. Here Genghis Khan took his seat in order to enjoy the spectacle of the slaughter, and then an immense number of men were allowed to go in and amuse themselves with killing and destroying the poor beasts till they were perfectly satiated with the sight of blood and of suffering. At last some of the Khan's grandsons, attended by several other young princes, approached the throne where the emperor was seated, and petitioned him to order the carnage to cease, and to allow the rest of the animals to go free. This petition the emperor granted. The lines were broken up. The animals that had escaped being massacred made their way back into the wilds again, and the hunt was over. The several detachments of the army then set out on their march back to the camp again, but so great was the scale on which this grand hunting expedition was conducted that 4 months elapsed between the time of their setting out upon it till the time of their return. The Grand Diet, or General Assembly of the States of Genghis Khan's empire, took place 2 or 3 years later, when the conquest of Western Asia was complete, and the sons of the emperor and all the great generals could be called together at the emperor's headquarters without much danger. The place chosen for this assembly was a vast plain in the vicinity of the city of Tukat, which has already been mentioned as one of the great cities conquered by Genghis Khan. Toukat lay in a central and convenient position for the purpose of this assembly. It was, moreover, a rich and beautiful city, and could furnish all that would be necessary for the wants of the assembly. The meeting, however, was not to be held in the city itself, but upon a great plain in the environs of it, where there was space for all the khans, with their numerous retinues, to pitch their tents. When the khans and chieftains began to assemble, there came first the sons of the king, returning from the various expeditions on which their father had sent them, and bringing with them magnificent presents. These presents, of course, consisted of the treasures and other valuables which they had taken in plunder from the various cities which had fallen into their hands. The presents which Genghis brought exceeded in value those of all the others. Among the rest there was a herd of horses, 100,000 in number. These horses had, of course, been seized in the pastures of the conquered countries, and were now brought to the emperor to be used by him in mounting his troops. They were arrayed in bands according to the color, white, dappled gray, bay, black, and spotted, of each kind an equal number. The emperor received and welcomed his sons with great joy, and readily accepted their presents. In return, he made presents to them from his own treasuries. After this, as other princes and khans came in and encamped with their troops and followers on the plain, the emperor entertained them all with a series of grand banquets and public diversions of all sorts. Among other things, a grand hunting party was organized, somewhat similar in the general plan to the one already described, only on a much smaller scale, of course, in respect to the number of persons engaged and the time occupied, while yet it greatly surpassed that one in magnificence and splendor. Several thousand beasts were slain, it is said, and a great number and variety of birds, which were taken by the falcons. At the end of the hunt a great banquet was given, which surpassed all the other feasts in munificence. They had on the tables of this banquet a great variety of drinks, not only rich wines from the southern countries, but beer and metheglin, and also sherbet, which the army had learned to make in Persia. In the meantime, the great space on the plain, which had been set apart for the encampment, had been gradually becoming filled up by the arrival of the khans, until at length, in every direction, as far as the eye could reach, the whole plain was covered with groups of tents and long lines of movable houses brought on wheels. The ground which the encampment covered was said by the historians to have been 7 leagues in extent. If the space occupied was anything at all approaching this magnitude, it could only be that the outer portions of it were occupied by the herdsmen and other servants of the khans, who had to take care of the cattle and horses of the troops, and to provide them with suitable pasture. Indeed, the great number of animals which these wandering tribes always took with them on their journeys rendered it necessary to appropriate a much larger space to their encampments than would have been otherwise required. It is surprising to us, who are accustomed to look upon living in tents as so exclusively an irregular and temporary expedient, to learn how completely this mode of life was reduced to a system in those days, and how perfect and complete all the arrangements relating to it were made. In this case, in the center of the encampment, a space of 2 leagues in length was regularly laid out in streets, squares, and marketplaces, like a town. Here were the emperor's quarters, with magnificent tents for himself and his immediate household, and multitudes of others of a plainer character for his servants and retainers. The tents of the other grand khans were near. They were made of rich materials, and ornamented in a sumptuous manner, and silken streamers of various colors floated in the wind from the summits of them. Besides these, there was an immense tent built for the assembly itself to hold its sessions in. This tent was so large, it is said, that it would contain 2,000 persons. It was covered with white, which made it very conspicuous. There were 2 entrance gates leading to the interior, One of them was called the Imperial Gate, and was for the use of Genghis Khan alone. The other was the Public Gate, and was used in general for the members of the assembly and for spectators. Within the tent was erected a magnificent throne, intended for the use of the emperor during the sessions of the assembly. A great amount of important business was transacted by the assembly while it continued in session, and many important edicts were made by the emperor. The constitution and laws of the empire were promulgated anew, and all necessary arrangements made for the government of the various provinces, both near and remote. At length, when these various objects had been accomplished, and the business was concluded, the emperor gave audience individually to all the princes, khans, generals, governors of provinces, and other grand dignitaries who were present on the occasion, in order that they might take their leave preparatory to returning to their several countries. When this ceremony was concluded, the encampment was broken up, and the various khans set off, each at the head of his own caravan, on the road leading to his own home. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of the History of Genghis Khan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Johns, Salt Lake City, Utah. The History of Genghis Khan by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 24. Conclusion. 1227. After the grand convocation described in the last chapter, Genghis Khan lived only 3 years. During this time he went on extending his conquests with the same triumphant success that had attended his previous operations. Having at length established his dominion in Western Asia on a permanent basis, he returned to the original seat of his empire in the East, after 7 years' absence, where he was received with great honor by the Mongol nation. He began again to extend his conquests in China. He was very successful. Indeed, with the exception of one great calamity which befell him, his career was one of continued and unexampled prosperity. The calamity was the death of his son Juki, his oldest, most distinguished, and best beloved son. The news of this event threw the Khan into a deep melancholy, so that for a time he lost all his interest in public affairs, and even the news of victories obtained in distant countries by his armies ceased to awaken any joyful emotions in his mind. The Khan was now, too, becoming quite advanced in life, being about 64 years old, which is an age at which the mind is slow to recover its lost elasticity. He did, however, slowly recover from the effects of his grief, and he then went on with his warlike preparations. He had conquered all the northern portion of China, and was now making arrangements for a grand invasion of the southern part, when at length, in the spring of the year 1227, he fell sick. He struggled against the disease during the summer, but at length in August he found himself growing worse, and he felt that his end was drawing nigh. His mind was occupied mainly, during all this interval, by arranging the details of the coming campaign, and making known to the officers around him all the particulars of his plans, in order that they might carry them out successfully after his decease. He was chiefly concerned, as well he might be, lest the generals should quarrel among each other after he should be gone, and he continually exhorted them to be united, and on no account to allow discord or dissensions to creep in and divide them. His oldest son, next to Juki, was Jagate, but he was of a mild and amiable temper, and not so well qualified to govern so widely extended an empire as the next son, whose name was Oktay. The next son to Oktay, whose name was Toli, was with his father at the time when his sickness at last assumed an immediately alarming character. This change for the worse, which convinced the emperor that his death was drawing nigh, took place one day when he was traveling with a portion of his army, being borne on a litter on account of his infirm and feeble condition. A halt was ordered, a camp was formed, and the great conqueror was borne to a tent, which was pitched for him on the spot near the borders of the forest. The physicians and the astrologers came around him, and tried to comfort him with encouraging predictions, but he knew by the pains that he felt, and by other inward sensations, that his hour had come. He accordingly ordered that all of his sons who were in the camp, and all the princes of his family, should be called in to his bedside. When they had all assembled, he caused himself to be raised up in his bed, and then made a short but very solemn address to them. "I leave you," said he, "the greatest empire in the world, but your preserving it depends upon your remaining always united. If discord steals in among you, all will most assuredly be lost." Then, turning to the great chieftains and khans who were standing by, the great nobles of his court, he appealed to them, as well as to the princes of his family, whether it was not just and reasonable that he, who had established the empire and built it up wholly from the very foundations, should have the right to name a successor to inherit it after he was gone. They all expressed a full assent to this proposition. His sons and the other princes of his family fell on their knees and said, "You are our father and our emperor, and we are your slaves. It is for us to bow in submission to all the commands with which you honor us, and to render the most implicit obedience to them." The Khan then proceeded to announce to the assembly that he had made choice of his son Oktay as his successor, and he declared him the Khan of Khans, which was the imperial title, according to the constitution. The whole assembly then kneeled again, and solemnly declared that they accepted the choice which the emperor had made, and promised allegiance and fidelity to the new sovereign so soon as he should be invested with power. The aged emperor then gave to his second son, Jagatay, a large country for his kingdom, which, however, he was, of course, to hold under the general sovereignty of his brother. He also appointed his son Tole, who was then present, to act as regent until Oktay should return. The assembly was then dismissed, and very soon afterward the great conqueror died. Tole, of course, immediately entered upon his office as regent, and under his direction the body of his father was interred, with great magnificence, under a venerable tree, where the Khan had rested himself with great satisfaction a few days before he was taken sick. The spot was a very beautiful one, and in due time a magnificent monument was erected over the grave. Trees were afterward planted around the spot, and other improvements were made in the grounds, by which it became at length, it was said, one of the finest sepulchres in the world. As soon as Oktay, whom the emperor had designated as his successor, returned home, he was at once proclaimed emperor, and established himself at his father's court. The news of the old emperor's death rapidly spread throughout Asia, and a succession of ambassadors were sent from all the provinces, principalities, and kingdoms throughout the empire, and also from such contiguous states as desired to maintain friendly relations with the new monarch, to bring addresses and messages of condolence from their respective rulers. And so great was the extent of country from which these ambassadors came, that a period of 6 months was consumed before these melancholy ceremonies were ended. The fate of the grand empire which Genghis Khan established was the same with that of all others that have arisen in the world from time to time, by the extension of the power of great military commanders over widely separated and heterogeneous nations. The sons and successors to whom the vast possessions descended soon quarreled among themselves, and the immense fabric fell to pieces in less time than it had taken to construct it. End of chapter 24. End of the History of Genghis Khan by Jacob Abbott.